Well, good morning. It is Sunday. Hope everyone is having a wonderful weekend. I have today off. Matter of fact, I might have actually Sundays off most of the summer here, actually, which would be kind of nice. I'm not really much of a Sunday person, but it is a good day to stream. So, yeah, I don't think I have a problem with having Sundays off permanently, at least for the next few months because of the way work schedule is working. So I'm okay with that. So, anyways, welcome. It is Caffeine Corner, where I kind of talk about things relating to critical thinking. This is kind of a different episode because I'm actually doing a review, which is not typically what I do on Caffeine Corner, and it's not Monday, it's Sunday. But hey, whatever. I needed a cool intro, so I'm doing a review, and it's my channel. So, anyways, let's kind of like give you a backstory on this. So this was something from Twitter a while back that I've been meaning to do, and I apologize I haven't gotten around to it. But this was something I ran across, and this was from a guy on Twitter named Jaco von der Bly. I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I apologize. But Jaco von der Bly. Is that close enough? I think so, but he could tell me if I got it close. But he seems to have this blog called The Amber Restorative: Skepticism, Humanism, Escapism. Okay, I'm all for skepticism, at least properly applied skepticism. I'm all for humanism when it's, again, properly applied, and I don't really know what escapism is, so I can't really talk about that, at least what he means by that. However, he does talk about one of my favorite topics of atheism, atheology. I happen to love talking about atheism, as you guys haven't realized by now. It's my niche, and I'm okay with that. People want to call me a one-hit wonder. That's perfectly fine with me. I don't mind. This is the subject I enjoy talking about, and again, I get to do that because it's my channel. So he wrote a blog about atheism called The Deep Dive into the Meaning of Atheism, posted up September 1st, 2022. And I had a chance to peruse it the other day. Well, this was actually a few weeks ago. Hit or miss. There's some things in here I do agree with, some things I completely don't. But I wanted to point out to him, if he does watch it, which he said he would, that there are, I think, some major epistemic and logical issues with his reasoning and his blog here. So, I mean, welcome, y'all out there: Reagan, Savali, April, Chemo, Antangelo, etc., etc. Welcome. Not a big audience for this kind of stuff, I know, but like I said, I do it for me. I do it for me because I enjoy it. So, all right. So he goes on to say, by the way, can you guys read that on the outside? Read along with me. People disagree about what atheism means. Well, yeah, because well, I don't know if it's so much a disagreement of what atheism means, because it means different things to different people. Words don't have intrinsic meaning. Matt Dillahunty points that out all the time, and he's absolutely right on that. Words don't have intrinsic meaning. What they have is meaning by usages. They have connotations and denotations. Denotation is more prescriptively of what something denotes, and connotation is what something infers. Most of us have an understanding of what certain words connote, what their meaning is to us when we hear that. If not, we wouldn't have intelligibility. We wouldn't have the ability to communicate if the words I'm using don't mean to me, at least similarly, what they mean to you. And every word has that kind of connotation, at least some sort of, when they have the ability to effectively communicate. If I say caffeine, y'all know I'm referring to some kind of chemical that's a stimulant, usually found in coffees and teas and things of that nature, right? Because you don't have to know the molecular makeup of coffee. You don't have to know the technical name. You don't have to know about biochemistry. But when I say the word caffeine, there's something that in your brain comports to some concept that you have of caffeine. Again, words have meaning by usages. So a disagreement about what atheism means isn't really a disagreement about what atheism means. It's maybe more what atheism should be best understood as. That's a better argument to be had. How should atheism as the word be best understood? That's a good argument there to talk about. Because there is no one correct answer. It's just, what do you think is the best usage? This essay aims to communicate my understanding of the term and a few related topics. Well, at least he's, letting people know this is how he views this, right? How it's best understood by him, and I do respect that to some degree there, obviously, because he's not putting it forth as absolute fact. He's putting it forth. Let me move this a little bit out of the way from the chat there. 1 sec. There we go. There we go. And I don't know if the chat's even working properly. It only seems to be coming up a little bit there. Let me see if I can fix the chat before I go on. It's just because I have it. Why is the chat only showing two things? I don't know. It says chat box. Let me see if I can fix that. There we go. I think that fixed that. All right, now we got some chat in there. All right. My intent is not to prescribe, but to better describe my specific position on the matter and to encourage contemplation. Okay, fair enough. He's not trying to prescribe anything. He's just saying, hey, this is what I think is better uses and why. I'm going to try to explain to him why his uses are not better by any means. This article offers no arguments for or against God. Good, because that conversation is boring to me. This purpose is to explore and define the different positions that people have on whether God exists or not. Okay, fair enough. I can dig that. Too long didn't read. Atheism is the lack of belief in the existence of God or gods. And again, he's putting forth this as his position. That is not the standard, typical understanding of atheism, philosophy, or academia. It hasn't been that ever, a matter of fact, especially for the last 400 years. And so this is him saying that atheism and lack of belief is his description of atheism, which we all who watch this channel know is nonsense and silly, but he hasn't got to that point yet. Hey, Lawrence. How you doing, buddy? And then he says agnosticism is a belief that it is not possible to know whether God exists or not. Well, that's fine for the epistemological domain, but that's not what people mean by agnosticism when talking about the existence of God, which is, again, connotations. When somebody says they're agnostic, they're not talking about no ability of God. They're talking about they have no position on the existence of God, no position on the existential nature of the status of God, existing or not existing. That's what agnostic means. I keep on having to explain this over and over and over and over again. That's what it means in academia, unmarked, which means no qualifiers, simpliciter, no other things, describing the word, saying, hey, I'm using this in the epistemological sense. If you just hear the phrase agnostic on P, or I'm an agnostic on that, that means that person is trying to convey to you that they have no position on the topic either way. That's how it's connoted. That is how it's inferred when people hear those particular words. Atheism is understood in philosophy as the belief there's no God, and agnosticism is the position there no belief either way. This is again how it is ubiquitously in every university, every peer-reviewed paper just about. I mean, it's 99%. I would have to guess. And of all the papers I have, I think one or two maybe differ, but they're opinion pieces from college. They're not even peer reviewed. They're just opinion pieces. And so I wouldn't even call them of anything of note. It's just some student saying this is, I think it's atheism is the belief. Atheism is mere lack of belief. It's no relevance to anything. As far as the actual academic papers, I can't find anything that supports any of this that he writes here, except for, again, agnosticism in the epistemological sense deals with the knowability of God. But again, irrelevant when we're talking about just a dostastic state of what is your position on the existence of God, right? If I just say I'm agnostic on the position of God, it means I have no position either way. It has nothing to do with knowability. So I think he gets really confused there when he starts throwing in, a completely different usage of the term agnosticism, which is not modern. It's not generally how it's used in contemporary analytical philosophy. You have to go way back a ways when agnosticism is used that way. You can still do it, absolutely, but you have to clarify to people what you mean when you say, hey, I'm agnostic, but in the epistemological sense, or my agnosticism is about the knowability of gods. Okay, that's great, but what is your position on God existing? Are you agnostic on God existing? Not knowability, but on God existing. This is where he seems to get confused, and a lot of atheists seem to get confused, because if you ask them, if you have no position either way, what is that called? Oh, that's called agnostic. That's how it means in philosophy. I don't know why they balk at that so much. It's bizarre. And then he goes on to say it is possible to be both an atheist and agnostic because the terms address two different considerations, that belief and knowledge, which are not mutually exclusive. It is possible to be an agnostic and an atheist if you're talking about two different things. Yes, but we're not. If you're saying, again, agnostic is on any proposition. If I said I'm agnostic on alien life, then yes, I'm agnostic on the position that there's alien life out there, extraterrestrial life, intelligent life. I have no position either way, although I think there is, but let's say hypothetically I have no position either way. Okay, then I could be an atheist, I could be agnostic, but I'm atheist towards God existing, and I'm agnostic towards aliens existing. Why would you want to bring those two together and say, oh, I could be agnostic atheist? That's silly. Why would you want to bring in completely two different propositions? And the knowability of God is a completely irrelevant proposition to whether you believe in God or not, exist or not. Why would you want to mix them? It makes no sense. And sure, knowledge is a subset of belief. And so people can say, well, it's not that I just believe there's no God. I know there's no God. And, or I believe that gods are knowable, and I believe that I know there's no God, or something along that lines. Okay, but that's not what I'm asking somebody when I'm asking them, does God exist? I don't care what you claim to know. Could you talk about it? Sure. But it just muddies the water when I'm asking somebody, what is your belief on God existence? And they start talking about knowledge. They've lost the plot. So somebody asked, Turbo asked, but isn't an agnostic by definition apart from theism, which is by definition the same thing as atheism? No, there's no such thing as by definition for a word in the English language that doesn't have defined parameters as it would in a specific domain of discourse. For example, a certain word in math means a certain thing. A square is well defined in math, right? And a rational number is well defined in math. A transcendental number is defined well prescriptively in math. A limit defined in math. I mean, these things are prescribed definitions, formal definitions. But an English word is not prescribed, it is described. I can say a square is described by four sides. That's absolutely correct. Does four sides describe a square? Yes, because a square has four sides. It is a necessary condition for a square to have four sides. Is it sufficient? No. Clearly in math, it is not sufficient because there are other objects like trapezoids and rhombuses and other parallelograms that do not have equal four sides and internal four right angles. So when we're talking about words, agnostic isn't described by any, it's merely described by a definition you're using for particular connotation, but there's no actual prescribed uses for it. He says atheism means without theism. That is incorrect. There's no university that teaches that. That is actually completely wrong. Atheism does not mean without theism. Actually, it means the Greek alpha privative, which came from the Greek word atheos, that meant without favor of the gods. It was a term used to describe Christians that had worshipped a monotheistic God that did not worship the state-sanctioned Roman pantheonic gods. So atheism was not without gods because clearly Christians were with a God. They believed in a monotheistic God. But atheos meant without Roman gods, without the pantheonic gods that had favor towards these, without favor to these Christians, because the Christians stopped worshiping them. They denied worship to the gods. Therefore, they were without gods, as in without favor of the gods. So atheos did not mean without a god. It meant without favor of the gods, right? So you can't say Christians without God. Atheos from the Greek original usage of the word meant to describe Christians. Now that English version does not come from atheos of Greek. It comes from the French version, which, I'm sure, came from Greek, at some point. But I mean, the more modern version of the word atheist came from atheisme, which meant denying or denial of God existence. So the French word, which now we call atheist or atheism, is derived from not the Greek, but from the French. So basically, atheism does not mean the negation of theism. It means the negation of the proposition of theism. The A in the Greek alpha privative means not as a negation. So if theism is the proposition that God exists, then atheism is a negation of that, which is the proposition God does not exist. So atheism means the proposition God does not exist. That's actually what it means in academia and philosophy. You can go look it up. Yeah. So, yeah, but if they insert, there's only one God, they're not going to believe in other gods, but they do believe in a God. So they're not without God. They clearly believe God exists if they're Christian. So atheos did not mean without God. It meant without favor of the gods. This is where a lot of atheists seem to get confused because they don't do any of their own research. They just listen to YouTube channels like mine that pretty much don't know what they're talking about. No, I do. I actually do know what I'm talking about. But they do listen to other YouTube channels that don't know what they're talking about. And when you confront them on them and you say, "Where's the evidence?" they just block you and ignore you and then crap on you. But I have the evidence, so whatever. Then he goes on to say, If the limited summary of the above the reader's only takeaway, I would feel reasonably satisfied. Well, you shouldn't, because you're putting out kind of misinformation there, bud. Because again, why do we care about the nobility of gods? Why do we care about being agnostic on irrelevant propositions that have nothing to do with whether God exists or not? If I said I'm agnostic atheist, but I mean agnostic to mean the proposition that aliens exist, and an atheist to mean I don't believe either way, that's kind of confusing. Why would you want to do such a thing? He says, however, these points do not paint the whole picture, and I would encourage readers to consider the full essay for nuance and completeness. Well, okay, let's do that. Let's consider this for nuance and completeness. Terminology. In this essay, quote, God is broadly defined as a supernatural being with a will that intentionally intervenes in the natural universe. I'm okay with that. That's a fine stipulative usage of the term God. I have no issue with that. Mine's very similar. Mine's something along the lines of an supernatural intentional agent that has the ability to prescriptively change the laws of the universe. Something along those lines. Yeah, intentional being. I like how you use intentionality. I will give him credit on that, because that's a big thing to me when we're talking about what is God. If God doesn't have an intentionality, I'm not going to even consider it a God. You can. I personally won't. Right? It has to have intentional states. And what I mean by intentional states is that it is an agent that does something. Right? A belief is an intentional verb, meaning that you believe something. You know, hate is an intentional verb. You hate something. You have an object. You have something doing the hating of something. Right? That's intentionality. There's an intention there. He goes on to say, for simplicity and style, quote, God is substituted for a god or gods. All references of God should be read to include both monotheism and polytheism. I absolutely agree with that. Same thing in my blog. I make that almost exact same statement. I really do. I mean, I don't say for simplicity or style, although I like it. I do say when I use the term God in my blog, I mean God or gods. Monotheist, polytheism, it doesn't matter. I'm using the word God to incorporate all references to God, past, present, and future, including deism, pantheism, anything you want to consider a God, if it's supernatural. Not of a natural God, because it's completely irrelevant. If you think you believe, your pencil is a God, okay, more power to you. I'm not going to put that under theism, though. I'm sorry. You can do have any schema you want, but that makes no sense to me, because then I have to ask, what's the difference between a normal pencil and a God pencil? If your pencil is a god, what is the property of that pencil that's different from any other pencil or pencil that somebody can go out, look at the two pencils and say, hey, this one's a deity and this one's not? You have to have some kind of differentiation. And if you don't have one, then it can't be a god. Now, that pencil can change the laws of the universe, then sure, but that's your belief, not mine. He goes on to say, quote, lacks belief, rejects belief, does not believe, and disbelieves are used interchangeably to mean lacks belief. It should be taken that disbelieves X and not mean believes not X. That's where he's wrong. This is where there's confusion. Look, if you're going to write a blog on basic logic or philosophy, you have to at least tell people how the terminological uses are used in logic and philosophy. In epistemology, to disbelieve means to believe false. That is how it's understood academically in any paper you read. I've never seen any paper where it doesn't mean that. So I think he's wrong to tell people that disbelieve just means does not believe, rather than believes not X. Because if you go read a paper on it, his usage here is wrong as far as how the paper is going to be using it. Now, he's free to use his uses any way he wants. I'm not trying to say otherwise. This is his blog, and he can say, I'm going to be using disbelief this particular way. But what he doesn't explain to people, which I think is a little bit dishonest, is that he's using it atypically from any other person who actually is going to write a blog on actual philosophy. Again, if you're going to write a blog about atheism, you need to explain the terminology, at least understood as it would be in an academic sense. Not just your own view. You could say, here's the academic version. Here's my view. This is where it differs. Okay, I'm fine with that. I can argue against that about why you really wouldn't want to do that. But to say disbelieve X does not mean believe not X is completely wrong from a logical point of view. You have three epistemic states: believe X, disbelieve X, neither believe X, or not X. Those are your only three rational epistemic states. There are no others. There's obviously believes both, but that's not rational. That's an epistemic contradiction. So you're just wrong on that. I hope that you do take that into heart, and if you at least correct something, correct that and say at least that you're using it atypically, and that in logic, though, disbelieve does mean believes not X. I have overwhelming evidence for that. You're welcome to see it anytime. Let me know. But that is completely, you can just ask any logistician that, and they'll tell you. Part one, what atheism is. Belief. To define what atheism is, we would do well to first clarify what atheism is about. So I'll start there. Okay, good. Let's do that. Let's start there. Atheism is about belief. I agree with that. Atheism subscribes a position with respect to belief on whether God exists. In other words, atheism, like theism, concerns belief. Okay, so far so good. I'm on board with that. What is belief? Eric Schwitzenberger, Schweitzelberger, I don't even know who that is, writes, contemporary philosopher, he's a philosopher, and I don't know who he is, so sorry. Contemporary philosophers of the mind generally use the term belief to refer to the attitude we have roughly when we take something to be the case regarding it as true. To believe something, in a sense, need and involve actively reflecting on it. That's true. What he's referring to here is dispensational beliefs versus on current beliefs. To believe something, we don't have to continue to think about it. We don't continually think about all our beliefs, so we're going insane. But when we have a belief, we hold that to be the position that something is true. So when people say, I know X, but I don't believe it, they're just ignorant of basic theories of knowledge. Or when they say, I don't just, I don't believe X, I know X. It's bizarre, right? Because they'll say, like, it's true, but I don't believe it. Well, why would you not believe something that's true? If you tell me you have no beliefs, that's just silly to me. You're just an idiot. If you say, I don't believe X equals X, I know it, you're an idiot. Because you can't know something without believing it. Because it's just like saying X equals X, but I don't believe it. You know how dumb you sound when you say that? Because that's essentially what you're saying. And I see people do this all the time on Twitter. All the time. And then they say, you're twisting my words, Steve. I'm like, no, I'm not. You're literally telling me you don't believe X equals X. I didn't say that. Okay, do you believe X equals X? Well, now you're asking me, a false dilemma. No, you either believe X equals X or you don't believe X equals X. There is no middle option. Which is it here? And if you don't believe X equals X, then I think you're irrational. If you can't justify your position of why you think it is okay to remain suspended judgment or neutral on X equals X and why you don't believe it, that's weird. Oh, well, we don't mean it that way. We have made judgment on it. We know X equals X. Oh, okay, but you don't believe it? Yeah, come on. If that doesn't sound like complete idiocy, then something's wrong with your epistemological framework there. Like, seriously. But yes, so Eric is correct on that. Yes. Knowledge. There is a different, and by the way, notice he is saying atheism here is about beliefs, Yeah, okay, then why does he go back to lack of belief? That's what we're going to find out here. Knowledge. There's a difference between what we know, what we believe, and what we know. That is correct. It is accepted that belief is a condition for knowledge. That is correct. Meaning that knowledge is a subset of belief. That is correct. In other words, to know something is to believe it, but crucially, if we do not know something, we necessarily either still believe it or not. Absolutely correct. So far, so good. There isn't an agreed upon definition of knowledge in epistemology. The philosophers still study of nature, origin, and limits of human knowledge. That is true. However, most people in philosophy do tend to justify true belief or some form of it. Justify true belief. Most people that are in epistemology that I've read tend to have what's called a truth tracking condition, like say sensitivity or safety conditions. But that goes into possible world theory. But it's just basically JTB with an extra condition to minimize the Getty air problems. But it doesn't eliminate them. As Dr. Linda Zabesky brilliantly pointed out, you cannot eliminate any or all Getty air. You can't eliminate all Getty air problems from any belief-first theory of knowledge because of what's called epistemic luck. And so, there isn't one agreed upon, but however, generally speaking, when you talk about knowledge without any qualifiers, it's generally assumed you're talking about justified true belief. I think most people would agree with that. If you don't, I'd like to know why. When I say I know P, what theory of knowledge do you think I'm talking about, if not justified true belief? Do you think I'm talking about Tarski's semantic theories? Do you think I'm talking about pragmatic theories of knowledge? Do you think I'm talking about popularity? Because there's a populist theory of knowledge too. Theory, not knowledge from popularity. It does exist, not a fallacy, by the way, by consensus of the population. I don't particularly like that particular one, but it does exist. You can say you know something if the rest of the population agrees that it's knowledge. Yeah, I think that's kind of a weird way to look at knowledge. But I mean, there are reasons why those theories do exist. They're almost, almost always more lax than the justified true belief one, because justified true belief requires three very specific conditions, all of which are necessary and combined provide sufficiency to say knowledge. Yeah. All right. He says, many philosophers still depend on Plato's definition, knowledge is justified true belief. That is, a person knows something if, it's if and only if P is true, S believes that P, and S is justified in believing that P. Absolutely true. That's straight from Stanford Encyclopedia Analysis of Knowledge. 100% correct. The justification condition means that it is not knowledge if a person believes a true thing by luck. Yes, that is true. Edmund Gettier did point out that by epistemic luck, it would not be considered to be knowledge. However, we also note that there is no possibility in justified true belief where you cannot have all conditions met to eliminate all Gettier types of cases. So it's just a problem in the theory of knowledge. Does it mean we shouldn't use it? No. It just means you have to be aware that there are issues and avoid those types of Gettier cases. In 1963, Edmund Gettier showed that there are possible cases where justified true belief is not knowledge because the justified belief is only true as a result of luck. Ever since, philosophers have tried to solve this problem by strengthening the justification condition, or by adding de-Gettiering conditions, JTP plus X. That's absolutely true. Or proposing new definitions for knowledge. To this day, no consensus has been reached. I agree with that. However, JTP plus, again, usually means JTP plus some kind of truth tracking condition, which has to do with the next possible worlds and the closest possible worlds, and if the subject would believe, given certain conditions in the next possible world, would it then be knowledge? And again, it's confusing, but that's basically what justified true belief plus is adding some kind of other condition to the justification. For the purpose of this essay, which is concerned about belief more than so knowledge, we may comfortably ignore the Gettier problem. Knowledge is justified true belief will suffice. I'm fine with that. Again, why do people talk about knowledge? We don't go around saying, hey, I know this or I know that, when it talks about the average Dostastic question. Do you believe in aliens? Yes. Do you know that? Well, I'm not claiming knowledge. I'm blaming belief. You don't really say, do you know they exist? No, of course not. Right? Do I believe we've been visited by aliens? No. Do I know that? No, but I don't believe aliens have ever been to this planet. I think we're so far out of the space highways that no other intelligent life probably knows we exist. Yeah, that's just, again, my belief. I could change on a dime. I'm not married to it by any means, but that's my current belief that aliens, or at least intelligent ages, somewhere exist in the universe, just probabilistically, and if they do exist, they're probably like us. They have no idea we even exist. Yeah. All right. Why theism and atheism matter? Okay, this has to do with more axiological things, but let's go into it. It goes without saying that we should aim to know as much as possible. Okay, but it follows that we believe more things than we actually know. And because it is evident that our beliefs affect our behavior, what we believe is at least important as what we know, if not more so. Yes, I mean, I agree with that. Since knowledge is a subset of belief, it follows, and it's a proper subset of belief, it follows that we believe more things than what we actually know. That actually would be basic set theory, sure. Belief in the Christian God, for example, will likely influence believers' attitudes on topics such as education, women's rights, and climate change, and their attitudes will likely affect how they vote for public policy, and in turn will affect people who do not share the Christian belief. For this reason, the topics of theism and atheism matter. I absolutely agree with that. 100% do I agree with that. We see that all the time. And people seem to have a hatchet approach to these subjects where if you can just convince people Christianity is wrong, all will be right in the universe, because you no longer have the people voting in people that disagree with the non-Christians, and will put public policy in place that the non-Christians don't agree with. And I understand that hatchet approach. I get that, right? But it's a much more difficult approach to take, because you're not going to eliminate Christianity overnight if that's your goal. And so I think the scalpel approach is much more effective, to slow cuts, to change overall opinions and minds of people, that if you have Christians that believe evil things, such as they should, throw gay people off buildings, or the government should execute gay people like Ken Hovind and his ilk believe, then yes, then maybe a hatchet approach is more appropriate. And I don't mean that take a hatchet to somebody. I mean to the ideas, obviously, clearly, before somebody twists my words. But I think it's very difficult to take the hatchet approach, that you're just all of a sudden going to convince people Christianity is wrong. I'm not against people trying to do that. I'm just saying that if Christianity affects voting habits and affects people's attitudes, which absolutely it does, then I think the way to do it is very slowly. And I've taken that approach, and other people I know have taken that approach, and we have changed minds that way. I think we all have changed minds. We've all influenced people. We've had people leave flat Earth. We've had people leave young Earth creationism. We've already had people even leave Christianity. But it's slow, and it's an uphill battle to change people's minds. And again, I don't care about the Christians who have their belief that don't want to influence government to change into some kind of theocracy, that want to worship the way they want and pray the way they want and do things the way they want. I'll power to them. That is freedom of religion. I am absolutely behind that. I'm a friendly agnostic, I guess you can say. I'm not going to steal that from the friendly atheist, but I'm a friendly agnostic in that I don't care whether somebody's agnostic, theist, or atheist. I just want to know what their positions and why, kind of thing. But I discuss, their views. That's it. If they want to talk about their views, let's talk about their views. But it doesn't really matter to me much if somebody is Christian or not Christian. It just really has no influence to me. It's what they do. That's why I think I do agree with them in this blog, is that I don't care about your belief. As far as your belief, you can believe whatever you want. It's your actions that affect me, right? If you sat there and believed everything in the world that I disagree with, everything that I hate, if you believed it, that doesn't affect me until you do something, right? You can just sit there and sit in a room by yourself and believe anything you want. It doesn't affect me. It doesn't affect me until you try to put your beliefs into some kind of political power to change the secular society and to change the separation of church and state to the point where we are now having religious indoctrination and things like school. That I'm very much against. Right? Anasfrida, good evening. Good, catching up. Good. I like when Anasfrida is here live. So. But yes, so I do agree with him wholeheartedly on this. I really do. And then he says, what is agnosticism? Well, this I think where it goes south a little bit, but let's see. I'm an agnostic, not an atheist. Well, that's me. It's a familiar point of view in my experience. One plausible implication hidden in this view is that belief in atheism and agnosticism are mutually exclusive. They are in philosophy. That's just not opinion. That's fact. That is logical fact that in standard understandings and typical understandings of these terms in philosophy, if you go to take a course in philosophy of religion, they will teach you that atheism and agnosticism are mutually exclusive. You can go read papers on this and see the logic. That is how it's taught. Sorry, you don't like it? That's, who cares? You're not the one putting out the books. You're not the one educating people on this topic who have actual PhDs on this topic of why atheism and agnosticism are mutually exclusive. But he goes on to say, in truth, a person can be both agnostic and atheist and agnostic, not on the same position. This is where you're wrong. On the same proposition, you cannot be both agnostic and atheist. What would that even mean? If the proposition is aliens exist, and I ask you, do you believe in aliens? And you say, I'm an agnostic atheist when it comes to aliens existing. You're not telling me if you believe or not. You're not telling me anything. I don't know what your position is. Do you believe there's aliens? Do you believe there's no aliens? Or are you neutral on it? Agnostic on P means you have no position either way. That's what it means. So if you say you're an atheist agnostic and I'm asking you what your belief is, again, he's up above saying, well, we're just going to talk about beliefs. Then why do we care about anything but knowledge? I'm not asking you about your knowledge claim about aliens. What is your dosastic claim about aliens? And if you say you're agnostic and an atheist, what does that mean then? Because we're not talking about knowledge. This is possible because on the question of whether God exists, atheism describes a position with respect to belief, while agnosticism describes a position with respect to knowledge, two separate concerns. That is wrong in modern contemporary philosophy, unless you explicitly say to somebody, I'm using this term agnosticism in the epistemological sense. As according to Stanford Encyclopedia, agnosticism is a psychological state of being agnostic where you have no position either way. This is Stanford Encyclopedia, which he cites, which is kind of funny. He actually cites down here, somewhere in here, Stanford Encyclopedia. I remember somewhere I saw Stanford Encyclopedia. Didn't he cite it? He cites, yeah, here we go. He cites encyclopedia, but he's talking about belief. Yeah, I do remember that from there. Yeah, that was part of the belief entry. But anyways, on atheism, if you look at the atheism entry from Dr. Paul Draper from SEP, which he doesn't have down there, which is surprising, he would realize he's wrong because Dr. Draper specifically points out that agnosticism is a psychological state of belief. You have no position either way. You believe that you're not able to make a informed decision whether God exists or not. So, sorry, you're just wrong on that. Agnosticism is a belief that it is not possible to know whether God exists or not when talking about God's existence. Again, wrong. Go read Stanford. You cite Stanford for something else under belief, but you don't cite Stanford under atheism, which is very clear that agnosticism in modern, contemporary, analytic philosophy is the psychological position of being agnostic on the proposition, where agnostic is said to be a person who does not believe God exists and doesn't believe God exists, nor believes God does not exist. So how do you rectify that? How do you rectify citing SEP but cherry picking the parts that you want to have, but negating all the parts that show that what you just said is wrong? Yeah, he cited Schweitzer-Berg and SEP, yeah. And I'm not sure who Eric is. I'm not familiar with that particular philosopher. Sue me. No, don't sue me. I don't need the lawsuit. As reasoned before, if we do not know something, we must still either believe it or not. That's true. It follows that agnostic either still believes that God exists or not. Put it differently, an agnostic is necessarily a theist or an atheist. That's nonsense. That's absolutely wrong. Nowhere in philosophy is that like that. Nowhere. No university teaches that. It's 100% wrong. Because if I asked you, what is on the proposition God does not exist, what is your position? You either believe that God does not exist or you don't believe that God does not exist. Okay. Well, if you believe God does not exist, I'm pretty sure people are going to call that atheist. I mean, what would you say if I said, hey, this person believes there's no God? You're not going to call them atheist? And by the way, that doesn't entail you don't believe, clearly. If you believe there's no God, it entails you don't believe there's a God. So even on the lack theist definition or usage, that would qualify. So either you believe there's no God or you don't believe there's no God. So if you believe there's no God, we're going to call it atheist, unless you have another term for that. Would be weird. And if you don't believe there's no God, then what do you want to call that? What word do you have for that position where you do not affirm the proposition that God does not exist? Well, the only thing I can think of, logically speaking, from the law of negation is non-atheist. You have atheist, you have non-atheist. That's just basic set theory, right? A or not a. Theist or not theist. Atheist or not atheist. So an atheist, under the proposition God does not exist, if you believe there's no God, then what else do you want to call that besides atheist? And if you don't believe that, then you're not atheist. That's why it makes sense in philosophy, because how is he going to be? If I said, do you believe there's no God? And you say you don't have a position either way, I'm going to take that as agnostic, because that's what agnostic means. I have no position either way. Right? If you say you don't believe, all I know at that point is you don't have the belief there's no God. And I'm going to put you under non-atheist. But you're going to say, but atheism means not to believe. Well, you didn't tell me what you don't believe about God existing. You told me what you believe about God not existing. So how the hell am I supposed to know what you mean by that? That's why it's so confusing. And then he says, agnosticism is not, as some may believe, a middle ground between theism and atheism. That's absolutely wrong. Like literally wrong. You can go read Dr. Demi. You can read Dr. Malpass. You can read Draper. Agnosticism is the middle ground between theism and atheism. Sorry, dude, you're just 100% wrong. This is why you have no academic citation for this, because it doesn't exist. Anybody who knows about agnosticism will tell you that agnosticism, logically, is not B, P, and not B, not P, which is does not believe P and does not believe not P. Every single logician I know would agree with that. Every single epistemologist I know agrees with that. Every single paper I've read agrees with that. So why are you putting out misinformation like this when no paper agrees with you? And people can go to my other videos to see the evidence. I'm not going to show it right here because you guys all know. But why does somebody lie? I mean, I don't want to say he's like lying. I don't want to say like being dishonest, but he has no evidence for this because it doesn't exist. He just made this is where he went from, I'm just going to put this as my opinion and how I use these terms, to a statement of fact. But this fact is not a fact because this is wrong. He can use it this way, but this is not how anybody else that I know in philosophy of religion that wrote a paper on this has used the term. None. I mean, do you guys want to see an image that proves this wrong? Do you guys care? Or do you guys just, you guys have seen it a million times, but if somebody actually wants to see the evidence, let me know. But if not, I'm just trying to get through this because we'll be here forever because you know how I can talk. But if you want to see the evidence, let me know. What is atheism? Because I got to go find it and put it on the stream. What is atheism? Following, there are three definitions of atheism. For atheism, the lack of belief. Well, there's more than that. I mean, there's like, I came up with 8 or 9 different polysemous definitions for atheism that I've found in various sources. The lack of belief in the existence of God or God, Oxford Dictionary definition, and this is a good one. It's not a good one. That's actually that is the worst one. And Oxford Dictionary actually says that in contemporary philosophy, the standard usage is the belief that God does not exist. Oxford Dictionary of Atheism actually has that. It actually says that's the standard usage. So the rejection of all theistic claims of God's existence. I dislike and avoid this definition because people can misunderstand what is meant by the word rejection. Rejection in logic means to hold false, to believe false. That's called Frege rejectionism. Rejectionism in the Frege approach is that you ascribe a false value to the proposition. Ascribing unwarranted qualities such as unwillingness to an atheist in context, rejection simply means disbelief. But again, he's using disbelief atypically. Rejection means disbelief, yes, but in logic, disbelief means belief false, which he's already said above. He doesn't use that way. This blog is just horrifyingly incorrect as far as what you would learn if you actually take a course in these subjects or read a book on these subjects or read a paper on these subjects. Disbelief means to believe, not X. I'm sorry, you're just wrong on that. When you cannot truthfully affirm, I believe God exists, my preferred definition, it is my own wording of a description I've read somewhere. I like this definition because it communicates the existence of atheism while also encouraging contemplation. People may just wonder, am I an atheist? Okay, but that doesn't make any sense to me. I cannot truthfully say I believe God exists. I'm agnostic on the proposition because I have no belief either way. Why would that be atheism? Why would you want that to be atheism? Why do you want atheism to be merely somebody who doesn't believe God exists? That just eliminates a person who has no position either way by subsuming that agnostic position, which you claim isn't the middle ground, which in philosophy is the middle ground. Again, you're wrong on that. So that is your preferred usage, okay, but that's not the preferred usage in any academic courses. That is not the preferred usage in any philosophical connotation. That is it's antithetical even to reason, because Dr. Draper in SEP points out 3 very specific reasons why should we avoid that definition. Dr. Draper is a PhD in philosophy who is an atheist philosopher who explains to atheists why your preferred definition is bad. I don't see in this blog where you address those 3 things. I don't see where you address any of the criticisms against that definition that you hold. But anyways, you're allowed to have it, but that's not normative, and you don't. And unfortunately, you don't point that out here. You just say, okay, that definition exists as my preferred definition, but it doesn't exist anywhere of consequence. He has it as for the life of me, I cannot remember where I read this description of atheism. I don't know, but it's certainly not any academic description, and that's probably why you don't have a citation for it, because it's horrible. It's horrible. Note, the only fact that we can extract from a single label atheism is that all atheists do not believe the existence of God. Inferring any quantity beyond this fact is speculation. Well, let's think about that. I could easily say the only fact we can extract from the single label theism is that all theists do not believe that God does not exist. Inferring any quantity beyond that fact is speculation. How is that not a true statement? Is there any example of a theist who believes God does not exist? No, because it's a contradiction. So all theists do not believe God does not exist. They lack a belief in God's non-existence. All theists do. So he's pointing out something that is true, but he's only stating a necessary condition, not a sufficient condition. As it's pointed out in SEP, the sufficient condition for atheism is the belief that God does not exist. That's sufficiency. If somebody says to believe there is no God, I have sufficient knowledge at that point to say that a person is atheist, according to understand, common usages. I have, because they're telling me, hey, look, I believe there's no God. Okay, well, that's atheist, right? I have both the necessary and sufficient conditions to be met to make that determination. But somebody says, I don't believe in God. I don't have the sufficiency to label them atheist. I don't know what their label is. Agnostics don't believe in God. It does not mean they're atheist. And again, that's where this guy clearly gets that wrong. To say agnostics or atheist is just so fundamentally wrong in philosophy. I have no words. But he doesn't seem to care about that because he's just going by on his preferred definition. That's fine. But the problem is he's stating this as fact, and he's not educating people properly when it comes to these subjects as taught in philosophy. Negative and positive atheism. So atheists lack a belief in the existence of God. Yes, theists lack a belief in the non-existence of God. So many people take this to mean that atheists must therefore believe that God does not exist. Well, it's not a must. The problem is that must is a modality word. Must is a term that signifies a conditions that have to be the case all the time. And that's not necessarily the case, right? You can define things differently, right? And so there's no onus to define atheism in any particular way. So if you say, according to sufficiency conditions, you must therefore believe there's no God to be an atheist, then that's true for sufficiency conditions. Because you can't just say, I lack a belief in God and know that somebody's an atheist, because they might be using different usages. But it's sufficient to say, I believe there's no God, because under, any single definition I've seen, that meets the criteria for what we understand as atheism, unless you're just finding atheism as something completely tangential. If I say atheism is now the belief that there's aliens, okay, so I'm using atheism to mean the lack of belief in aliens or something. Okay, but how am I supposed to know how you're using atheism there? If I say what's your position on aliens and you say atheist, I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to understand you believe there's no aliens, so I can infer that from your usage, right? But it's really a very atypical usage of the term, right? Most people would say something along this line, maybe as they're atheistic, meaning relating to atheism as the belief that God does not exist, but not ostensibly the same thing, right? I can understand that. Are you atheistic toward aliens? You say yes, yeah, then I get it. I'm understanding that you're meaning that you're leaning towards the belief there are no aliens. You're atheistic toward aliens. Nothing wrong with that. But generally speaking, when he says many people take this to mean that atheists must therefore believe that God does not exist. Well, if you want to be philosophically atheist, under the philosophical usages, and I'll just call it philosophical atheism, then yes, the sufficient condition is the belief that God does not exist. So you must believe that God does not exist in order to qualify for what I would call philosophical atheism. Yes. On the flip side, there's an opinion that atheism is only ever the lack of belief God's existence. Both views are false. Well, again, depends on what you're talking about. If you're talking about philosophical atheism, then yes, you must believe that God does not exist for philosophical atheism. So I am qualifying that there. In this context, there are two types of atheism, as described by Anthony Flew. My paper absolutely refutes Flew. My paper, I think, is a strong argument against accepting Flew's treatise, isn't treaty. I really think that Flew was very bad at his argument in a presumption of atheism. That's why I wrote my paper refuting him. But he tries to say that, hey, look, atheism as standard is a belief that God does not exist, but I want it to be thought of differently. This was back in 1971. He's arguing that, yes, atheism is understood as a belief God does not exist, but I want it understood as a negative, is what he said. In this context, there are two types of atheism, and they are negative atheism, the lack of belief in the existence of God, also known as weak or soft atheism. Positive atheism, the belief that God does not exist, also known as strong as hard atheism. Yes, that is how Anthony Flew, Michael Martin, and even to some extent George Smith, who wasn't an actual philosopher, used that term. That is true. But it follows, as Dr. Oppie points out, and my paper proves logically, that if you have negative atheism and positive atheism, you're not barred from having positive theism and negative atheism. So if you're allowing negative atheism, positive atheism, it follows by epistemic implication that you could have negative theism, positive theism. And if you don't allow them to make that move, that is called special pleading. That is the weak atheist special pleading argument that I have, WASP argument that I have. That if you allow for negative and positive atheism, you must therefore allow for weak and positive theism. What is the difference between lack of belief in existence and the quote belief in non-existence? They are effectively not the same. We may be tempted to think so, but that would be a mistake. Well, yes and no. This is where I think that he might not fully understand the linguistics of this, because there is something in linguistics called neg-raising, negation raising. And neg-raising, for negative raising or negation raising, is the propensity of a certain clause to be raised to the negation. Now, this doesn't work in logic. So he is correct logically. If I say I do not believe P, it is not logically the same as I believe not P. However, I believe not P does logically entail, or epistemically entail, I don't believe. Right? It's not, I shouldn't say a logical entailment as far as logical necessity. It's more of an epistemic necessity. But that's crippling, I guess. I don't want to pettifog too much. But logically, yes. If I say I do not believe, that does not logically infer or entail that I believe not P. However, grammatically speaking, it could. And the reason being is this is just a quirk of the English language. If somebody says, hey, Steve, are you going to the party tonight? And I say, I don't think I'm going to the party. How are you going to interpret that? You interpret that as I'm not going. That's just how the English language works because of the way the clauses work. You know? And so when you hey, say, Steve, do you think blah 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 is this? And I say, no, I don't think so. You're going to think that you're going to hold the position that I believe that's false. It's just because that's what it seems to be communicating. There's more technicalities when it comes to neg raising. It's that's all the subject and predication and clause, and it's beyond my purview. But needless to say, in English, if I say I don't believe something, it could be inferred as believing negation. Now, again, there's problems with that logically because of contraries. That if you read my blog on contraries, the negation of a contrary isn't necessarily the double negation, which people do get confused on with double negation. But anyways, so he's kind of right, but he's kind of wrong. Again, he doesn't clarify, logically versus linguistically. To show the difference between why the distinction matters, Matt Dillahunty's analogy about gumballs proves helpful. Sort of. Go read, and I'll put it in the video description. Go read my blog, Gumballs and God, Better Explained. I take Matt Dillahunty's analogy and explain it much better than Matt Dillahunty ever did, because Matt Dillahunty's argument seems to invalidate his lifelong position. So it's weird. Consider Gumballs analogy. Consider a gumball machine jam-packed with gumballs and consider the fact that gumballs are being even or odd in number. Okay. We can make the following claims about this binary proposition. An even number of gumballs exists in the machine, and even number of gumballs do not exist in the machine, i.e. odd number exists. Okay, and that's true. If you don't have any broken ones, if they're all quantified, it is either the case that they're even or not even, and not even means odd. It is the case that they're odd or not odd, and not odd means even. So there is a ontological dichotomy that exists, that the number of gumballs existing in that jar is either even or odd. That is a fact. Imagine three people, Bob, Fred, and Jane, stand some distance away from the machine. Bob says to Jane, there's an even number of gumballs in that machine. Claim A. Jane replies, why do you say that? Bob shrugs and says, trust me, there's an even number. You can put money on it. Jane is not convinced because Bob offered no good reason, which reasons why his claim is likely true. And looking at the machine, it's not apparent to her that the gumballs are even. It happens that Jane does not believe Bob. The question is, does Jane's disbelief of a claim, again, he's using disbelief differently than anybody in the subject uses, but whatever. Gumballs are even means she required to believe gumballs are odd. Evidently, this is not the case. Imagine Fred says to Jane, Bob is mistaken. There are, in fact, an odd number of gumballs. Claim B. He likewise offers no explanation. Jane does not believe Fred for the same reason she disbelieves Bob. Lack of evidence. She certainly has the option to believe Fred and Bob, not Bob, but she's not required to believe them. Okay. What position does Jane have now? She's been given two propositions. Propositions that are contradictories. If one is true, the other is false, and vice versa. They both can't be true at the same time. They both cannot be false at the same time. These are what's called a true contradiction, mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. If the number of Gumballs is true, that is even, it is false that they're odd. If it's true that they're odd, it's false that they're even. They both can't. It has to be true or false, so it cannot be both true and false. It cannot be both even and odd at the same time, and one of them has to be the case. That's called a contradiction. But Jane doesn't believe either. Jane doesn't believe either proposition. She doesn't believe the proposition that gumballs are even. She doesn't believe the proposition that gumballs are odd. Oh, wait, we have a word for that. Anybody want to guess the word for that? In my live chat, can you guys tell me what is the word for that? Somebody who doesn't believe either position. And if even is the person saying God exists, and odd is the person saying God does not exist, and if a person who doesn't believe even or odd, we have a word for that. It's the same word because it stands for a person who doesn't believe either proposition. They are on the fence. They're fence sitting. Matter of fact, maybe I will show this. If I can. Let me see here. Sources. Let me find Dr. Malpass's image on this because it's really good. And just so this guy, because he may not have seen actual evidence when he wrote this. Hang on, I gotta wait a sec. I bought a wireless keyboard, and maybe the battery's dying because it takes like a minute to connect. It's really odd. So, give me a second here. Anybody else has that problem with a wireless keyboard? The red light comes on, which means battery, but then it finally does connect and works fine, but it just takes forever to connect. Like I said, I just got this not too long ago. It's super quiet though. That's why I like it. But it just takes so long to connect. I got so much stuff I got to find where I put this. So I got to type it in. Still not connecting. One sec. It'll eventually connect. Well, yeah, I can show my image at least here. So this is for everybody out there. This is the McRae Knoll Venn diagram that I'll show you in a second. That shows too the actual relationship in philosophy of these positions. The agnostic holds the position where you don't believe God exists, you don't believe God does not exist. So it is a middle ground, proven by Venn diagrams. But I'm going to show you Dr. Malpass's. Here we go. So this is Dr. Malpass's version on his use of reason, which I'll show you here in a second. Oh, look at that. Agnostic, the middle ground between atheism and theism. When you're talking about even and odd, because he's talking about the gumballs here. The theist is saying the number of gumballs is even. The atheist is saying the number of gumballs is odd. They're two different propositions. The agnostic is saying, I don't have belief either way. I don't believe P, I don't believe not P. Jane here is the agnostic. In his own blog, this guy is explaining that Jane is the middle position between two different propositions, even and odd. Does he not understand what he's saying here? Because he's literally showing what he said earlier is not correct. He's showing a position of Jane who has the middle ground between two different propositions. The proposition that's even, the proposition that is odd, which are contradictories. Just like atheism and theism are contradictories. If one is true, the other is false. If God exists, atheism is false. If God does not exist, theism is false. They both can't be true at the same time because God does exist or does not exist. It is one or the other. So either theism is true or atheism is true. It's one or the other, but they both can't be true and they both can't be false. This is why they're called contradictories. But oh look, you don't have to believe either, right? Just because one of the other cases must be true, just like the gumballs, it must be true that they're even or odd. You don't have to believe either one of them, right? Beliefs are different. Beliefs are not dichotomous like that. So yeah, he's just wrong, and he's showing right here why Gnosticism is a middle position. Weird, right? And like I said, I'll link my essay to the video afterwards. Learnings from the gumball analogy. The difference. The analogy shows that to disbelieve one claim of the binary position is to believe the opposite claim are not essentially the same. They're fundamentally different. Well, yeah, sure, but again, you're using disbelief wrong as far as how philosophers or logicians would use it. I shouldn't say wrong. I hate you say that. Let me retract that. You're using the word disbelief in a very atypical way that you will never find in any academic paper on logic that I've ever found. So he's using disbelief to mean basically does not believe, which, again, his own personal usage. But, I mean, sure, you don't have to believe the proposition even to believe it's odd. I get that. The gumball analogy is correct when it comes to that. Jane does not have to believe it's even to say she doesn't accept it's odd. She doesn't have to believe it's odd to say she doesn't accept that it's even. Sure. But when she does that, she's agnostic. She's saying, I don't believe either position. She's agnostic on even or odd. And what the lack belief the atheist does, well, she's not saying it's odd, therefore we're going to put her in evenist, even though she's not accepting it's even. That's the same thing this guy's doing by using his usages. He's saying there's two propositions. There's a proposition that God exists. There's a proposition that God does not exist. Well, he doesn't really actually say this, but let's assume that he does, because I think he understands that. There are two propositions. Every proposition has a negation. So the proposition God exists, and the negation is proposition God does not exist. There are two different propositions. If you don't accept God exists, you don't have to accept the proposition that God does not exist. That is true. But by doing so, you're accepting neither proposition. So if you're accepting neither proposition, why label them an evenist? If you don't accept their odd, sure, you cannot say at that point that person is an evenist, but this person here used lack of belief atheism, which is exactly doing that. There's no difference. He's saying, hey, look, you're not accepting or affirming the proposition God exists, therefore you're an atheist. Well, all he has to do is think to himself, wait a minute, I'm doing the exact same thing I'm arguing against here. I am saying that the person does not accept they're even, therefore I'm going to put them as an oddist, because now an oddist is somebody who doesn't believe that they're even and or believes that they're odd. So strong oddism would be somebody who believes that the number of gumballs are odd. A weak oddist would be somebody who does not accept that they're even. And by extension, without loss of generality, if you are a weak evenist, you are somebody who doesn't believe they're even. And if you're a strong evenist, you're somebody who believes that they're even. Oh, excuse me, let me rephrase that. A weak evenist would be somebody who doesn't believe that they're odd. And a strong evenist would be somebody who actually believes that they're even, which would entail you don't believe they're odd. But you know what? You think this is easy, guys? You guys think about this in your head. Seriously, man, I'm too sober for this, man. This is why I have to have caffeine. Seriously, if you guys think this is easy, thinking about this kind of stuff and explaining it in a way, make a video trying it. It's not as easy as it seems. And watch somebody do that, be like, damn, yeah, that was right on. Yeah, I'm sure my audience could probably do it, but yeah, for the average person, yeah, it's not as easy as it looks. But did you guys make sense? He's literally just kind of shooting himself in the foot with this, because by using the gumballs, he's showing that if you don't accept even, sure, you don't have to accept they're odd, but he's calling them oddest anyways, because that's what Theism is. It's just using the contradictory label and subsuming that by saying, oh, well, you don't accept they're an evenist, you're a weak oddist. And if you're weak oddist, we're just going to call you oddist. Same exact thing. Oh, you don't believe there's God? Well, then we're going to call you atheist. And we're just, even though it's weak atheism, we're just going to call that atheism. It is the exact same thing. And I'm sorry, what was your name again? Who wrote this blog? Jaco, you're just not understanding that. And I really do hope you're corrected. I really do. Look, if Jaco comes back and said, man, I watched your video, and dude, I didn't think about any of that stuff before, and I'm going to change things, I'm going to be impressed, and I'll have him on and whatever he wants to do, and I will thoroughly be impressed and say, look, it can change people's minds when you give them facts, evidence, and logic and reason, and some people are reasonable. We'll see that he does or not. And like I said, I'll shout him out, absolutely shout him out for changing his positions. But if he doubles down, I'm going to want to know why, because I've been thorough in my reasonable, logical, semi-articulate explanation that he's doing the same thing that the gumball analogy is doing. He's saying that if you're not an oddist, you must be, or if you don't believe that they're odd, you must be a lack belief evenist. And we're just going to call that even. Same thing. All right, let's see here. Learning, the distinction matters. Consider the old legal axiom. Incumbent probatio que dicit no que negat. I can't speak Latin. But it means the burden of proof lies upon those who affirm, not who he denies. This is called onus probandi. This is the old adage that that somebody who has a burden of proof only lies on the person who affirms. This is not true, by the way. To deny something means believe false. But what they're trying to explain is that if you come into court, you have the burden of proof if to make your case. And again, if you deny something, you still have to prove. You have to prove in court your denial. If I say, "Hey, look, I wasn't." Let me do this very, very carefully because we want to twist my words here. You're innocent until proven guilty. True, and you don't have a notice to say, "Look, I have to prove that I wasn't there." Right? If they say, "Hey, look, you were there. You committed the crime." You don't have to prove that you didn't commit the crime. You don't have to be shown that you weren't found guilty of it. That is true. But there's something called the burden of defense. And the burden of defense is a type of burden of proof. The defense, if the defense can show you weren't there, that will prove to the jury sufficiently that you're not guilty of the crime. I mean, it actually shows that you're innocent, although you can't be found innocent in a court of law. It shows that you weren't there sufficiently to justify saying that you didn't commit the crime, right? So there's a burden of defense, which is a type of burden of proof. So these old legal axioms are just not really that strong when it comes to that, because if you deny something, yes, you do have a burden of proof. Epistemically, even. If I say I don't believe you, I have an epistemic entailment to be rational, that if I want to be rational, I have a burden of proof. Bob and Fred are making the claims. Okay. Bob is saying they're even. Fred is saying they're odd. How is that any difference between somebody saying God exists and somebody saying God does not exist? Those are the claims. And Jane here doesn't believe either, which is agnostic. And both of them have a burden of proof, sure, but Jaden has a burden of proof to meet too, of why she didn't affirm either. This is called an epistemic burden of proof. Even if she determined to convince other people not to believe Bob and Fred, imagine the two have started proselytizing, trying to convert the arcade. Her only responsibility would be to argue that the men have failed to meet the burden of proof and therefore belief is not warranted. But that's so silly. Look, burden of proof is very subjective. And if you just said, hey, this person has not met their burden of proof, who the hell cares? That's your opinion. Doesn't mean anything. Show me why they didn't meet their burden of proof, and we'll talk. Show me your argument for that. But that's your burden of proof to claim they didn't meet their burden of proof. You're making a claim here that they did not make their burden of proof. Okay, show us why. That's a claim. You're claiming a state of affairs that they failed to make their burden of proof. And this is what happens all the time in a court of law, sure. But you're just making a statement. How do you know what they've made their burden or not? For example, my paper. My paper is a logical argument. If somebody says, hey, Steve, you failed to meet your burden of proof by proving it, show me where. This is the logical proof. Show me where I made an error. If somebody says, hey, you failed to meet your burden of proof because you didn't convince me, I don't care. My burden of proof has nothing to do with whether you're convinced or not. My burden of proof has nothing to do with whether you believe me or not. I couldn't care less. What I care about is, can you show my papers wrong? So when somebody says Bob and Fred have failed to meet their burden of proof, explain why. Now, if you say, hey, Bob and Fred have no reasons to believe either, they even said that they're just guessing. This is their justification. They say, hey, look, I'm guessing that it's even, therefore you should believe me. Then, yeah, you could argue, well, neither of them, I argue that neither of them are justified to believe either, and therefore I'm going to suspend judgment. Bob has not convinced me that they're even. Why? Because he's just guessing. Fred has not convinced me that they're odd because he's just guessing. Therefore, yeah, in that circumstance, you could argue that they failed to meet their burden of proof to themselves because they're just guessing. And guessing is not something that can be considered rational to hold a belief. It's you can say irrational. It doesn't necessarily mean irrational, but it could be irrational. But you want to base your burdens and your beliefs on positive reasons. You want to base upon why you hold a particular belief, not somebody else who failed to meet theirs. I don't want my beliefs based upon what other people have failed to show me. I want my beliefs to be on a coherentist level of a web of my beliefs, and are they conjoined with each other in such a way that there's a coherent consistencies. I don't want to have an outlier in my belief that, for example, if somebody says I'm a ontological naturalist, but I believe in ghosts, there's a contradiction there. There's an outlier. It doesn't congeal with the rest of their coherentist belief system, their web of belief. It doesn't fit in. It's an outlier because it's contradiction. You can't say you're an ontological naturalist that believe in ghosts. There's an epistemic contradiction there. There's a problem. And so base your burden of proofs on what you believe, not what somebody failed to do. But Jane here, he says, Jane here, however, does not have a burden of proof. Well, you're wrong on that. Jane doesn't have an obligatory burden of proof for evidential reasons or for discursory reasons or for persuasion reasons, but she certainly has an epistemic burden of proof to herself why she failed to affirm. Again, this person may not understand there's many types of burden of proof. There's not just one. There's many burden of proofs going on in any discussion. There are, again, discursory burdens, evidential burdens, burden of persuasion, burden of production, burden of refutation, burden of rejoinder, burden of defense. Many different types of burden of proof. So yes, Jane does have a burden of proof, but her burden of proof isn't evidential. She doesn't have to show anything. Her burden is, why did she fail to affirm either proposition? If somebody says X equals X and you say, hey, I don't affirm X equals X, I withhold judgment on it, wouldn't you want to know why the person doesn't believe X equals X? Are they rational? Yes, you have to justify you're not believing X equals X, because that is a foundation for reason. That's the law of logic. It's the rule, law of identity. Mostly, it's all of X equals all of X equals X, but whatever. So yeah, if I have somebody who doesn't believe X equals X, I'm not going to take them seriously. I'm not going to take them as a rational agent, because I want to know why they don't believe in something so fundamental. Why would you not have a burden of proof for that? Think about that. If somebody says, I don't believe you exist, aren't you going to want to know why? Wait, you're telling me you don't believe that I exist? And they'll say, yeah. Okay. And then they say, well, I don't have a burden of proof to justify that. Yeah, you do to yourself. Sure, you don't have to tell me. You have no onus to persuade me. I get that. That's a discursory burden. But if you want to persuade somebody, then you have a persuasion burden. Burden of persuasion is called. But if you have no interest in changing my mind, then sure, you have no obligation or nothing, no burden of proof to me. But you certainly have one to yourself if you want to claim to be rational. If you don't want to claim rationality, then I would agree you don't have an epistemic burden. I can just say, look, I don't believe X equals X, and I'm okay with being non-rational about it. Okay. But if you say X equals X, and I'm rational to deny that, I'm going to think you're irrational, and you're probably quite possibly an idiot. So yes, you do have an epistemic burden of proof. Even if she's determined to convince other people not to believe Bob and Fred, imagine the two had started... wait, I haven't read that. Okay. Default position. Jane knows that either Bob or Fred must be correct. That's okay. But she was not given good reasons to show who might be right. As a result, she's not convinced enough to believe either of them. Well, again, good reason is very subjective, But let's say she counted them. Then she has reasons to believe, right? She counted them, so she says, yeah, I counted them and they're even. But that's a positive reason. There's a positive justification. But her reasoning should not be because she was not given good reason. That's silly. That's bad epistemology. Why don't you believe? Well, I was given no reason to believe. That's an egotist position. Who are you? Why is it about you when it comes to, whether you're justified to believe or not? What it should be is, I don't believe either way because both people are guessing, and I have nothing to draw upon to even rationally infer whether they're even or odd. You can say that. That's fine. That's a positive reason. What is your positive reason? The positive reason is because I do not have sufficient information to make a conclusion. That's positive. I'm okay with that. And it really doesn't matter what Bob or Fred say, right? Because there might be other information I can get from a third party, So So I don't really care what Fred and Bob tell me. Who cares whether they didn't give me sufficient reason or not? It's again, it's holistic. It's all your information that you have. It's not just Bob and Fred. So why would you want to frame your belief solely on Fred and Bob? That makes no sense. It just is like if I said X equals X, and I say I'm not giving you any reasons to believe this. I'm just stating X equals X, but I'm not going to give you any reasons to believe it. Should you say, well, Steve didn't give me any reasons to believe X equals X, therefore I'm going to withhold information. I'm not going to believe X equals X. Because why? Steve didn't give me any reason to. No, that's stupid. You believe X equals X because you have other reasons to believe X equals X because you have understanding of basic logic. You don't base your beliefs on what somebody doesn't give you. That is the atheist experience approach. It's stupid. It makes people look silly. Gumballs and God. We can apply our learnings to the binary proposition of God. God exists. God does not exist. Okay, that's ontologically true. Theists and positive atheists. Theists believe claim A, and positive atheists believe claim B. Okay, so let me ask you, why did you differentiate between theist and then positive atheist? Why didn't you say positive theist believe? If you have positive atheist, you have positive theist. Why do you have to add positive atheist here? In philosophy, atheism is the belief that God does not exist. But here you're going out of your way to differentiate atheism between positive and negative atheism, but you don't have the same consideration to theist. Why? If a theist said, hey, look, I'm going to use theist to mean anybody who doesn't believe God does not exist, they're allowed to do that, according to your usages. You have to allow them to do that, or that is special pleading. So I find it to be disingenuous that you split theist, but you don't split atheist in those categories. Every proposition has a coextensive negation to it. The proposition of theism is that God exists, which means there's a coextensive proposition, the claim or the belief that God does not exist, or this, the proposition God does not exist. They have to exist in tandem. Is true or not true? I mean, it's just they have to, or true or false. It has to exist. For every proposition, there's a truth and there's a false value if it's truth apt. So I think it's being a little dishonest here. Both groups have the burden of proof if they determine to convince other people of their beliefs, or if their beliefs meaningfully impact people who do not share the beliefs. Well, yeah, if you want to convince other people, sure. That is a type of burden of proof called evidential or burden of proof or persuasion. But again, why are you separating positive atheists here? Because I have proven logically that weak atheists are agnostic logically. Weak atheism, weak theism, and agnosticism are logically the same position. This is proven. I don't think anybody disagrees with that nowadays. If you do, please show me why, but I think I've convinced everybody of that. Even my diehard haters on the atheist community, I think they've at least realized logically that weak atheism is agnosticism. They're embracing that, even some of them, because they're like, oh yeah, that's why atheists are agnostics, because I'm going to differentiate atheism into these two subcategories. I'm going to call it weak atheism, and weak atheism is the same as agnostic. That's what this guy did here. So I think he would embrace that. What he doesn't tell you is you can do the same thing to theism. Weak theism. Oh yeah, you're an agnostic. You're just a weak theist. We're going to call you theist, which, by the way, my paper proves axiologically devalues these words, where you can have somebody who is a weak theist, a weak atheist, and who's agnostic. And if you start using terms like weak atheism to mean atheist simpliciter, you have somebody who's an agnostic and an atheist, as this person points out here, and you have somebody who's also a theist. Because I'm just going to say weak atheism means theist simpliciter. Why can't you make that move? So now you have somebody who's a theist, atheist, and agnostic, and these words mean nothing any longer, as my paper shows. Negative atheist. Negative atheists do not believe claim A, and they do not believe claim B. That's called agnostic. Again, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Oxford, Cambridge, all of them. Merriam-Webster, even under secularism, describes agnostic as the position of not holding a belief either way, not relating to knowledge. They do not have a burden of proof. Well, I don't think you've read Michael Martin. Dr. Michael Martin, who was a contemporary of Flew, who actually accepted negative atheism, agreed that negative atheists have a burden of proof. This is a pretty strong supporter of negative atheism, but he did find some flaws in Flu's arguments. But in his writings, Michael Martin says that yes, negative atheists do have a burden of proof. Why? Because you want to have a rational position. To rationalize a position, you need a burden of proof. Your reasons, your justifications for holding something to be the case. If you're a negative atheist, but you have no reason to be a negative atheist, you cannot be rational in that position. Why do you lack a belief? If you don't have a rational reason to lack a belief, then you cannot be held as somebody who has a rational position. Irrational, maybe. Again, doesn't necessarily have to be irrational, but you cannot rationalize it without a burden of proof. So Dr. Michael Martin argues, if you fail to affirm God's existence, why? That's a burden of proof for that. And that's not hard to meet, but it's still a burden of proof. So yes, negative atheist does have a burden of proof. You're just wrong on that. The literature goes against everything you're saying here. I'm sorry, but academia just doesn't agree with you on this. If they are determined to convince other people not to believe theists and positive atheists, their only responsibility would be to argue that theists and positive atheists have failed to meet their burden of proof, and therefore belief is not warranted. Again, why? Why base your opinion on what they failed to do? And again, why you separate a positive atheist? And why would you not want a negative atheist position to be rational? It makes no sense. And again, if you're talking about the dosastic domain, where you're eliminating knowledge, I'm just talking about dosasticism, your beliefs. What does this person think agnostic means? If we're not talking about knowledge, if I just say I'm agnostic on P, what does he think that means in the literature? It clearly means you don't have a position either way, which he's now, saying is the same as negative atheism, and he's right logically. I've proven that. He's actually correct on that. But why would you want two terms to mean the same thing? It's confusing. Why would you want a position of somebody who believes there's no God? Just like if there's a position of somebody who believes there's a God, and we're going to call that theist, and it's a very general domain. I mean, theism is very, very generalized, right? If somebody says they're a theist, it doesn't tell me much about their actual beliefs. It just tells me they believe there's a God. Okay, cool, right? And there's a lot you can get from that. Sure, I'm not discounting that, but it doesn't tell me what flavor they are, right? Are they, evangelical? Are they Baptist? Are they Protestant? Are they Lutheran? Are they Satanists that believe in God? Some of them do, and they worship actual Satan. Very few, but what is their position? It doesn't tell me anything that they believe in God, but of course it is something that is conveying information. That's cool. I'm cool with that. But why would you not want a position that conveys the opposite position? If you want a position for somebody to hold that there is a God, and we're going to label that, we're going to call that theism, why would you not want to have a label for the position of the contradiction of that there is no God? It seems to be very utilitarian. You have utility. It has a utility to say, what is your position? My position is there is no God. It tells me something. It tells me that you believe that there's no God. And I'm like, okay, well, what is your reasons for that? Let's talk about that. We can talk about that. Well, I believe there's no God because of this argument and that argument and this and this and this. And that's fascinating. I don't get in the whole there is a God or is not a God debate, but why people believe one way or another, yeah, I'm a little more interested in that. All right, he goes on to say, combining belief and knowledge. Consider the following definitions. Gnostic, a person who claims to know. That's weird. I can tell you right now, nowhere in the literature is that the case. Gnostic is a very specific form of a word that meant divine knowledge or esoteric knowledge. It had nothing to do with epistemic knowledge, never did. I'm sorry, but go reading a dictionary that just says, dealing with knowledge, doesn't tell you an awful lot about the term. It meant a very specific type of knowledge, a subset, maybe, of epistemic. Well, it's not even a subset of epistemic knowledge, I don't think. Because the knowledge Gnostic talks about was of awareness of an unknown God. And I've already talked about that in other videos. I'm not going to get into it too much now. But Gnostic did not mean to know. It meant to have divine knowledge of an unknown God, that when Sophia fell from Plamora, she instilled that knowledge into people that Yaldabaoth, the trickster god, created the earth, but didn't create the heavens, and she wanted people to know that upon falling from grace. And so she instilled this very specific knowledge of the divine, and that divine or gnosis is what somebody who believes that is called a Gnostic person. So somebody who's a Gnostic, not agnostic, but a noun, a Gnostic. There's somebody who believes that. So it had nothing to do with knowledge, regular knowledge. Agnostic, a person who does not claim to know. Again, that's not, the term agnostic never was coined that way. Thomas Henry Huxley coined the term agnostic, had nothing to do with Gnosticism. The only relationship is that he felt that theists and atheists of his day were acting like modern Gnostics, claiming that they had information or hidden knowledge about God that the average person doesn't know because, or is unaware of, because they're making claims about God on a non-scientific grounding. And Thomas Henry Huxley, when he coined the term agnosticism, it was a normative epistemic principle that you should not believe anything without proper and sufficient scientific grounding. That's an archaic usage of the term. Some people still hold to it, but for the general consensus, they don't use the term like that any longer. But that's what he used it as, a normative epistemic principle. Had nothing to do with a person who doesn't know. Matter of fact, Wiki makes it very clear, don't conflate the two, and this person conflates the two. Gnostic and agnostic are not related. Matter of fact, he might not know this, but Huxley did not even use the term gnosis when he coined the term as a neologism, agnostic. He didn't use gnosis. What he used was nous. And what he meant by that was the illusion of having knowledge. He felt that both theist and atheist, and at the time, the atheist was somebody still who believes there's no God. It wasn't a lack belief. It was somebody who holds the position there are no gods. That he felt that they all had illusion of having this information about God that they couldn't make any substantive claims about, or substantive claims about, because there's no scientific information about God. So how can anybody say God exists or God does not exist if there's no scientific evidence either way, because science is excluded from the God claim because of methodological naturalism? That's what his argument was. So he was a agnostic, meaning that he was not a theist nor atheist. That's how he coined the term. He felt like a fox without a tail. He didn't have a term for himself because everybody's running around going, God exists. God does not exist. He's like, wait a minute. I don't believe either of you. I think both of you guys are making uninformed conclusions. Put that to the gumball analogy. Going back to Fred and Bob. Jane is going, Fred and Bob, you both of you guys are making these qualified statements about the gumballs in the jar. Bob, you're saying that they're even. Fred, you're saying that they're odd. I don't believe either of you. Jane's agnostic on the gumballs. That's how he's coined the term. So this person has a gross misunderstanding of these two terms. They're not related. And I don't think he's ever read a single paper on it because he just went to the dictionary and said, oh, I'll use it this way. But that's not how these terms are used in academia. If we combine this with our understanding of theist and atheist, it can help better describe a person whose overall position of the God exists. And he goes through and he starts dividing these up in the most bizarre way that, again, no university teaches because it's just epistemically untenable. I've already shown multiple times how the logic doesn't work out, how there's issues with lack of belief atheism when using the quadrant system. You're changing the object being modified. And if you have an epistemic modification, you have to have a dostastic belief first. You have to have something to modify. And if you don't have a belief, you cannot not modify with knowledge because knowledge is the subset belief. This is what convinced Matt Dillahunty that the term agnostic atheism is nonsensical in the weak case. It was my arguments that did that, yes. So he says, Gnostic theist, a person who believes and claims to know that God exists. What? Okay, first of all, sure, if you want to claim to know there's God exists, that's fine. But why do I care what you know? I'm asking about your beliefs. Does God exist? It's not asking you what you know. It's asking you what you believe. Does God exist? Yes. Okay, you're a theist. No, God, you're an atheist. I have no position either way. I don't know how to answer the question. It's not I don't know as in I don't have knowledge. It's I don't know in the general sense of I don't know how to answer your question. Therefore, I'm agnostic. I suspend judgment. But let's get rid of the whole knowledge thing. What is it? What do you call a person who believes there's no God? A person who believes there's a God. Okay, I'm just going to call them a theist. Then he says a Gnostic atheist, a person who believes and claims to know that God does not exist. Okay, but again, why are you introducing knowledge here? I just don't find it to be relevant when you're asking somebody about their beliefs. Then if you want to go into their if they want to claim it as knowledge, that's fine, but it adds a lot more layers to the conversation that seem to just bog them down. Agnostic theist, a person who believes but does not claim to know that God exists. Okay, how does that differ from just a theist? This is where the problems come in. A theist as a person who believes God exists, but is not making any claim to knowledge. They're not required to make any claims to knowledge. So explain to me the difference between an agnostic theist, and just a theist. Now you can argue, I'm going to steel man his argument and say, well, an agnostic theist is a person who believes there's no God and doesn't claim to know. A theist, you could make the claim to knowledge or not. It doesn't tell you as much information. So agnostic theist is more specific. That's how they would steel man that, right? But again, the counter to that is, sure, agnostic theist may be more specific in that you're telling somebody I'm not claiming to know. But the counter to that is a theist is strictly in the domestic domain anyways. If you're saying you're a theist, you're only imparting to somebody that you believe there's a God. You're not making any claims to knowledge anyways. So why then divvy it up anymore? Why add in that knowledge attribute? I don't understand why you would want to do that when you're just asking somebody, what is your beliefs? It's very confusing. And then it gets more and more confusing. Look, he divides up agnostic atheist, but he doesn't divide up agnostic theist. Why? If you have one, you have to have the other, right? Or you can't have the other. Agnostic atheist positive. Agnostic positive atheist. Oh, this is so confusing. A person who believes but does not claim to know that God does not exist. Why not just call that atheist, as the rest of the educated world does in philosophy and religion? You've now went from changing the typical usage of the word atheist to believe from somebody who believes to, oh, I'm gonna have agnostic positive atheist. You're just adding in superfluous words that don't change anything. Agnostic positive atheist in philosophy is confusing because you're using agnostic here as something to do with no ability. But now it gets even more confusing. Agnostic negative atheist. This is where it's nonsensical. A person who does not believe and therefore cannot claim to know that God does not exist. The problem with this is that if you're agnostic negative atheist, then what are you modifying for Gnostic atheist? Nothing. You cannot be an agnostic negative atheist and then modify that to Gnostic atheist because you don't believe first. So the schema for agnostic atheist would only work in the agnostic positive atheist case, which is just atheism as philosophy. The only way this quadrant system works, and I've proven this logically multiple times, is that atheism is the belief that God does not exist. Then you're going to have the quadrant system. I get that. The only reason you shouldn't is because, one, it's confusing, and two, it doesn't change anything from these words in the strictly theistic domain. Theist, somebody who believes God exists, is not making any claim to knowledge, right? That's why bring in the knowledge things. But if you say atheism is merely a lack of belief, this system falls apart. It's ambiguous. It's nonsensical. But it's very, again, I'm showing logically in my blog, it's ambiguous because you don't have a belief. It's somebody who does not believe and does not know. Okay, if you don't believe and you don't know, I have no idea what your position is. And you cannot then take that object of non-belief and raise it to Gnostic atheist because you don't have to believe first. The only way you can do that is with agnostic positive atheist. The agnostic positive atheism is belief God does not exist. Therefore, you can raise that to say, no, God does not exist because you have belief first. That's the object. The object is believe God does not exist. That's the object that you're raising. I can raise that then to knowledge because I believe first. But if I have the object of does not believe God exists, there's no belief claim there to raise. And the quadrant system changes here because for the theist, he has theism as a belief God does not exist. Therefore, agnostic theism is the knowledge that God does not exist. Okay, you can do that logically because you have a belief first. Theism as a belief God does not exist. I can raise that to Gnostic theist as he wants and make it a knowledge claim. Sure. But the only way to do that with atheism is if atheism is the belief that God does not exist. Then you can raise that to Gnostic atheist. You cannot raise it to Gnostic atheism by merely lacking a belief because it's ambiguous and you don't have a belief for first condition. As he points out, knowledge is a subset of belief. So this schema is crapola. No university teaches it. No rational atheist who wants to be taken seriously in philosophy of religion should use this. And if you go on Twitter and you start using this stuff, the people that know what they're talking about are not going to take you seriously. They're going to mock you. They're going to mock you. I've seen it all the time. Implicit and explicit atheism. As described by George A. Smith, who is not a philosopher, atheism may be divided broadly into two categories. Implicit atheism, the absence of theistic belief without a conscious rejection of it. Implicit atheism, the absence of theistic belief due to a conscious rejectionism. That is true as far as George Smith's writings, A Case Against God. It's silly, and you need an Euler diagram to describe it properly. You can't really use a Venn diagram, but at least I don't think you can. But an Euler diagram describes it better. Yes, this is what he was using it for those terms, but what about implicit and explicit theism then? If you have one, you have to be able to have it applicable to the negation of the proposition. If you allow for one, you have to allow for the other. You can't just hand wave that away. So you have implicit theism, the absence of atheist belief without a conscious rejection of it, or implicit theism, the absence of theistic belief due to a conscious rejectionism. Right? Explicit theism would therefore be the theistic belief due to a conscious rejection of it. Yeah. A rejection of the proposition God does not exist, obviously. So if you have implicit atheism and explicit atheism, you clearly have to have implicit theism, explicit theism. And by the way, implicit atheism would apply to anything. Babies would be implicit atheist. Rocks would be implicit atheist. And by the way, some people actually go one step further and argue that rocks are atheist. Babies are atheist. And that's based upon this implicit atheism belief. Examples of implicit atheism: people who have no familiarity with the idea of God, such as newborn babies or a person from the pariah people. They don't have any conception of God, I guess. Yeah. Okay. But I've already proven that implicit atheism would entail weak atheism, which would mean that they are also agnostic and weak theist, which means that if you want to call implicit atheism, you have to say implicit theism is theism. So therefore that newborn baby is now an implicit atheist, an implicit theist, an agnostic, and we're just going to call implicit atheism atheism and implicit theism theism. So now that baby is theist, atheist, and agnostic. Congratulations. By the way, my paper shows this. This is what this person who wrote this blog doesn't understand. They're not understanding their use of reasoning is one-sided, that if you allow for one, you have to allow for the other, and this is where the confusion comes in. If you want to call a baby an atheist, that's silly to me. They have no understanding of the proposition. And the term isn't implicit atheist. The term is ignorant or innocent of the proposition. Oppie prefers innocent of the proposition. I like that, but I like ignorant of the proposition. A baby is ignorant on P, but innocent on P is fine. And again, ignorant on P is just my usage, but whatever. But both of them infer that the baby is not aware of the proposition. Okay, but what about the proposition God does not exist? A baby is unaware. It is ignorant of the proposition that God does not exist. It is innocent of the proposition God does not exist. So should we call them a theist because of weak theism? You have to allow that argument, man. You have to allow that argument, or else you're special pleading. And you could sit there till you're blue in the face while saying, well, theists don't say that about theism. Irrelevant. You can't allow for that. In my paper, I allow for that. I allow for weak theism because why not? You can't say I can't have weak theism if you're arguing weak atheism. And what happens if you have weak theism? Well, now you have a baby that's a weak theist. And now you have people that are saying, well, you know what, I'm just going to call weak theism theism. Just like I call weak atheism atheism. Now that baby is now a theist. This is how your argument and reason and logic end up with. This is the conclusion. This is argumentum ad absurdum in a way. Because it's showing the absurdity of your argumentation here, man. Because you're just saying, oh, babies are atheists, implicit atheists, but they're also implicit theists. By the same logical reasoning. Smith continues and states, the category of implicit atheism also applies to the person who is familiar with theistic beliefs, but does not assent to them, but who has not explicitly rejected belief in God. By refusing to commit himself, this person has maybe undecided or indifferent, but the fact remains that he does not believe in God, therefore he is also an implicit atheist. Smith was not a deep thinker, man, because Again, you can word this exactly the same way in the negation. The category of implicit theism also applies to the person who is familiar with atheistic beliefs but does not assent to them, but who has not explicitly rejected belief in non-God or non-existence of God. By refusing to commit himself, this person may be undecided or indifferent, which, by the way, is agnostic versus apatheism. But the fact remains that he does not believe God does not exist. Therefore, he is an applied theist. See how I can reword that? I can reword that because that's how reason works. If you allow for one, you have to allow for the other. Explicit atheists include all other atheists, people who have contemplated theistic beliefs and consciously reject it. So a theist can just say, well, explicit theism has included all theists, people who have contemplated atheistic belief and have consciously rejected it. So a theist is somebody who says the atheist belief that God does not exist is false, or the proposition God does not exist is false. Okay, well, that means they believe it's true, right? If you say that something is false, if I say that the proposition theism, or the proposition that there is no God is false, I'm saying the proposition there is a God is true. And vice versa, obviously. The distinction between implicit and explicit atheism is not as important as the negative and positive atheism, but I've explored its meaning for the sake of completeness. We have finally concluded my understanding of what atheism is, and I think your understanding of atheism is poor. I think it is confusing. I think it is not in consensus with general academic uses of a word, and I think it goes against everything that I've ever read about atheism from an academic standpoint. How much more have we got here? Okay, we're almost through, guys. Part 2. I'll try to speed this up. What atheism is not and other musings. What atheism is not. Atheism, like theism, is not itself a worldview or ideology. The label cannot reliably inform you about beliefs or values of an individual. I disagree with that. I think if you want it to be a worldview, you can. If you don't, that's fine too. It's up to you. But yes, the label can inform people of certain things as an individual. Beliefs are not held in a vacuum. If I say I believe there's no God, that tells me certain things about my other beliefs. I believe that I have no reason to go to church. I believe that there's no such thing as sin. I believe that, the Adam and Eve story is nonsense, or at least, nothing I believe in. There are the things you could reasonably infer from a single label. They may not be correct, but they're reasonable inferences. If somebody says, hey, look, I believe there's no supernatural, I can reasonably infer that person believes there's no ghost. Why? Because there's an epistemic entailment there. I could be wrong. They could be somebody who has weird beliefs and contradictions, like saying, hey, I'm an ontological naturalist, but I believe there's ghosts. Sure. But again, we're talking about reasonable inferences. So if somebody says you're an atheist, I can infer something from that, just like I can from a theist. Okay, they believe in God. Okay, they probably believe that, God created the universe. Reasonable inference. Again, they're outliers, but these are reasonable other things. And so, yes, they are worldviews and ideologies in some ways, because you can infer something from that simple label of theist or atheist. But again, you can argue, look, I don't believe there are such things as worldviews. I believe there's only one worldview, and that's your theory of the world. It's a holistic approach. That's how I look at worldviews mostly. There's one worldview. Yours, mine, and somebody else's. They're all holistic. In that worldview, you have, subsets and smaller worldviews. Sure, okay. But to me, a worldview is your overall outlook of something. But, you can have, other worldviews, like secularism, I believe, is a worldview. I don't know why atheists push back on that. I really don't. What's so scary about having a worldview? If atheism was a worldview, so what? What does that matter? Why are you scared of that? If somebody says, hey, look, atheism is a worldview, and I look upon the world as a godless world, who cares? Who cares if that's a worldview? I mean, sure. I mean, I don't mean that pejoratively. I just mean it's like, okay, well, they call it a worldview. Great. Why do you care if they call that a worldview or not? I don't understand why you're so giving a crap about somebody's uses of worldview or not. It can be a worldview if they want it to be. It's part of their worldview. Their outlook on the world, the theory of everything, their theory of the universe, or how they it's more like in how you apprehend the universe. A worldview to me is an overall holistic view on how you apprehend the universe. And it entails everything else you believe, all your beliefs, everything you believe and know, and your existence. That's a worldview to me. it's a holistic. But anyways, of course, there are atheists who share common worldviews and theologies. Many adopt secular humanism, lean left politically, and care passionately about social justice and the separation of church and state, which likely explains the prevalence of atheist movements, but it isn't a mistake to attribute these to any other qualifiers or matter of course. Well, again, yeah, I agree. If you're an atheist, you don't have to hold to any of those things. But if you're an atheist, it does give indications of other things. Beliefs don't exist in a vacuum. I keep explaining to people. If you say you're an atheist, I'm going to be able to infer some other things. I'm going to be able to infer that you probably don't go to church. You may. I can't say you don't, obviously. That'd be weird. And there are probably atheists. I'm sure there are atheists that go to church. They do exist. But it's reasonable to refer probabilistically that if I said, what is your stance on the ontological status of God? And you say, I'm an atheist. And I say, okay, I'm going to reasonably conclude you don't go to church. I'm rational to believe that. Doesn't mean I can't be wrong. But your statement of that you're an atheist does infer to me other things, other related things. It infers to me that you don't believe that God exists. That God created the universe. It infers to me that you don't believe in a creation story. So it does infer things about a person. Atheists are diverse, holding not just varying, but even irreconcilable beliefs and values. They are regular people, your friends, family, and colleagues. They're no more joyless or amoral than anyone else. Yeah, that's fine. I'm not, whatever. I agree. On labels, it is obvious that no one label fully describe a person. I am an atheist, but the label, despite having an impact on my outlook, describes little about me. Well, especially if you use a lack of belief. You made it now even less versatile, less utilitarian. Having less utility, because when you're describing yourself, all you're saying now is that you don't believe God exists, but it doesn't tell me what your position is. It doesn't tell me what you believe. If you do not believe in God, it's because you believe God's false, the proposition is false, or you have no position either way. That tells me something. Do you have a position on God's existence? If you don't have a position on it, it tells me you're agnostic. But if you tell me you're an atheist, I have no idea what you mean by that now, because now you've changed the word to where it means very little, because I don't know whether infer is that your position is you're agnostic and suspended judgment and have no belief the other way, or that you actually hold the belief there's no God. Putting aside all the subdivisions you have for the labels and the implicit, explicit, strong, weak, whatever, put that away. There's only 3 epistemic dispositions here. Believe true, believe false, have no position either way. You, by telling me you're an atheist here, does not tell me which epistemic disposition you have. Do you see the problem? You've watered down the word where now you made it impossible, and it is undetermined what position you have by you saying, I am an atheist. Before, even as SEP notes this. SEP notes that when people wrote atheists, they didn't have to worry about explaining it to people. It was understood that's the epistemic disposition of believing there's no God. Now it's confusing. Now when you say you're an atheist, I'm like, what the hell do you mean by that? Because you haven't told me what epistemic disposition you are. You see the problem? If you say, you're a theist, I understand that as somebody who believes there's a God. There's no ambiguity there. Why? Because theists don't make this silly argument about negative and positive atheists. And so I understand when somebody says they're a theist, to understand that is they believe there's no God. Actually, they believe there's a God. So can somebody explain to me, if this guy says I'm an atheist, can you tell me what he means by that as far as his epistemic disposition? Can you infer? No, you can't. It's ambiguous. So why would an atheist want a word to be ambiguous? If I say I'm a non-duck, does it tell you what I am? No. If I say, hey, Kimamaki, here's an animal. And you say, hey, Steve, what is that animal? And I say, well, it's not a duck. I'm not telling you what that animal is. It's underdetermined. I just say, look, it's not a duck. Okay, but that doesn't give you any information about what it is. It tells you what it's not, but it doesn't tell you what it is. So, do you guys agree that when he says he's an atheist, you have no idea what he means by it? It's ambiguous, and this is the main problem here. The biggest issue is that he's devaluing the word to where it doesn't really connote anything any longer, or it's confusing what it connotes. Despite having an impact on just a secular humanist, skeptic, and critical thinker, on the other hand, these labels do a better job of revealing who I am and want to be. Okay, that's fine, but that's relating to philosophy. I think he means skeptic here. But that's fine, but why relate those to atheism? I mean, I don't mind to some degree. I think atheists should involve secular humanism, and I'm fine with skepticism because that's their arguments of why they're justifying their atheism. And I think that critical thinking should be applied to both theist and atheist. But if somebody says I'm an atheist, and they talk about being skeptic as far as ordinary skepticism, not academic skepticism or Pyrrhonian skepticism, but skepticism is just, I'm not going to believe everything easy. I'm not going to be gullible, because that's what the skeptics here kind of mean. They talk about gullibility. I don't particularly like that usage, but I do use it myself. But yes, I think that an atheist can argue, hey, look, there's no God, and people should be skeptical of certain claims relating to God claims. Okay, you can argue that. Nothing wrong with that. Why not argue that? But that to say there's no relationship, that's kind of disingenuous, because yes, atheism is about beliefs, but there are atheist movements out there and atheist organizations, and they don't all sit around going, well, actually, what's funny is they do all sit around going, I just don't believe you. I lack a belief. No, but they do dive into other things like secular humanism and skepticism and things of that nature. But if all they did was, oh, we're an organization and we just don't believe in God, that's it. It wouldn't be much of an organization. Right? And even still, most of them who say that actually hold the belief there are no God. Right? I've found out over many discussions that most theists actually hold the belief there are no gods. They just, for some reason, don't want to say it. Most, in my experience, right? Again, I can't make it categorical to all that exists, but in my experience, most of the ones I've talked to, in my experience, have been actual, what this guy would call straying atheists, which is just atheist, pretending to be agnostic by saying they merely lack a belief. And when we come to recognize that when it comes to labels, people have preferences, and that is fine. We might judge someone to be an atheist given the description of the position, but the person might want to identify as agnostic instead, or secular humanist, skeptic, free thinker. Okay, yeah, but again, if I identify agnostic, which I do, that tells you one of the three epistemic dispositions. It tells you that I've suspended judgment. You tell me you're atheist, by your usages, doesn't tell me which epistemic disposition you have. It doesn't tell me whether you believe, disbelieve, or suspend judgment. Especially on the proposition God does not exist. Because on the proposition God does not exist, you believe God does not exist, you disbelieve God does not exist, meaning you do believe it false, or you have no position either way. I don't know what this position is on that proposition. What is your position on the proposition God does not exist? That's what I want to know. I'm not asking him what his proposition is on God does exist. I want to know what his proposition on God does not exist. And if he says, well, I don't hold a belief that there is no God, welcome to Jane's world. That's agnostic. That's Jane in the Gumballs. You're agnostic. You have no position either way. You're not even, you're not honest. I'm hoping that he understands this, but I don't know. I evidently care deeply about meanings of labels, but descriptions were always trump labels and in avoiding the miscommunication and misconceptions. But you're making it worse. You're adding to miscommunication and misconceptions because of your uses of terms and your weird, bizarre, multi-axual approach to doxism and epistemology, where you have knowledge on one axis and belief on another axis, when knowledge is a subset of belief. It should be linear, like Dr. Malpass that I showed earlier. It should be linear, not or orthogonal. Why would you have an orthogonal position for knowledge if knowledge is a subset of belief? How do you justify that? When you have an independent variable on the y-axis from the x-axis, they're independent of each other. That's why it's called the independent axis. But knowledge and belief are not independent. They're codependent because knowledge is a subset of belief. So please explain to me in your Gnostic, atheist, theist, whatever diagram that you're going by. He doesn't show the diagram, but that's what he's using. Can you explain to me why you would have knowledge orthogonal to belief if knowledge is a subset of belief? usually when you have an orthogonal position, it's independent. In the quadratic system where you have four quads, and even then, even in a four quad system, you have a range and domain. You have somewhere where, given an initial conditions, the output is going to put you somewhere in a function in that domain. In the quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. But in the four quadrant system that he's going by, there really is no, I would say, quantifications for that. They're not ordinal pairs. Usually you have an ordinal pair, right? 0, 0 would be origin. So right there in the middle, between on the X and Y axis, your origin, that's where, you would start from. But that's not how he's using, that's not how they're using these multi-axial diagrams, which is kind of weird. But be that as it may, explain to me why you're putting knowledge orthogonal to belief when it's a subset. That makes no sense to me. Does it make sense to anybody else? Because it shouldn't. I am aware of those who are so dogmatic about labels that they turn a deaf ear to people's descriptions of what they mean. It's not that people are dogmatic about labels. It's somebody like myself and Answers in Reason, Joe and Dave and Kawasa and other people, Whizbang and other people that are out there on Twitter going, look, we're not dogmatic about the labels. We're just explaining to you why your usage is poor. It's silly. It's antithetical to critical thinking. It's not rational. It's not justified because you're just basing it upon misinformation that you get from the internet rather than actual academic sources, and it leads to absurdities. I've shown by reductio they lead to absurdities. That's what they're showing you. It's not dogmatic where you're saying, well, you must use these languages, these words in philosophy. No. It's saying if you don't use them, this is the ramifications of your argument. This is the conclusions by using reason of what happens by using your arguments. That's what they're telling you. And by the way, the people that are dogmatic about it are the lack theists. They're the ones that are like, oh, atheism is just a lack of belief. And anybody says otherwise, wrong. Oh, if you think atheism is a belief that God does not exist, you're just wrong. They're the ones that are dogmatic because they're idiots. I have little time for interlocutors who attempt to invalidate the person's described position by wagging definition words. Well, that's what you're doing, though. You're doing that. We're explaining you why your argument is wrong. It's not about definition. We're not saying, hey, look, here's a definition used in philosophy. You must use this. We're saying if you don't use this, this is what happens. These are the results of using poor uses of terms that you're using. Neither do I have the inclination to engage with people who hyper-define terms to win an argument. To such as these, to endeavor to learn or educate means too little. Why indulge them? Why do you think we get sick of lack theist? Because that's what they're doing. They're breaking out a definition from a Google search and dictionary saying atheism, a disbelief or lack of belief that God exists. They're wagging that in people's faces, not understanding that that's descriptive, not prescriptive, and that is atypical usage. This is why you don't use a generic dictionary when you're talking about certain terms from a more advanced domain of discourse. If you want to learn about biology, you're not going to open up, a dictionary and say, oh, this is how this word used by the dictionary. No, you're probably going to use a medical dictionary. You're probably going to use an academic source to say, how is this word used if I go read a paper about some medical procedure? How is this word used? And if you use some colloquial understanding of that word in a medical procedure, you could get into trouble probably. You don't want to use colloquial understandings when you're doing a very specific procedure medically, because that could be dangerous. So no, you want to know exactly what they're saying in these papers, what words they use that connote a specific meaning to everybody who understands the topic. That's why it's important to have precision. So, all right. Let's see here. Disbelievers unite. Again, he's using that word atypically. He can do it, but that's not how it's used in logic and philosophy. There's an argument to be made, mostly for political reasons, that disbelievers would do well to unite under a single label, like believers did when they pushed the Christian label to fight Roe v. Wade in the early 70s. I would embrace atheists to that end, but if required, but humanist is my label of preference. Okay, yeah, I'm whatever. I got no issue with that, really. Atheism is naturally contrasted against the behemoth that is theism, where humanism is more inclusive with a counterpoint that's less clear. Okay. In the UK, British Humanist Society does good work to protect and promote secular concerns. Okay. Many organizations, particularly in the U.S., that have been successful in defending secular values are openly atheist movements, like the Satanic Temple. That is unfortunate for secularists who don't publicly identify as atheists, but it is what it is. I agree. I mean, look, you can have a secular group, a secular humanist group that promotes certain things without involving atheism. Sure. You can have atheism movements that don't involve secular humanism. Sure. But it all depends what your end goal is and what you want to discuss. If you just want to talk about theology or epistemology or philosophy, then you don't need to involve any of these secular stuff as far as the humanist stuff, as far as the movements, because you're not talking about changing government or talking about the role of church, the fence and church separation of church and state. You're not involving yourself with that. But if you just want to talk about beliefs, then yeah, then it helps to just have atheism and theism. Avoiding atheism. In my experience, it is not unusual to find people who are reluctant to adopt the atheist label, even if that may be what they are, but you are assigning your label to them, or your usages here. You start off saying that you're talking about descriptive things and that your usages, but now you're prescribing them. You're saying that may be what they are. Well, how do you know what they are? Because you just are defining them to be atheists if they lack a belief. But if they lack a belief, you have no idea what they are, philosophically speaking. It's ambiguous. All you know is they're not a theist. Legitimate reasons for this may include, well, let's find out here, because people accuse me all the time. People are like, Steve, you just don't want to adopt the atheist label. Okay, but why? Why would I care? I mean, I listen to satanic music. I tend to Satanism because I think the Satanic Temple does good work. I'm not a member of it, nor do I have any intention of joining, but I think they do good work. And I like the 7 tenets of Satanism. I think, for the most part, with some minor caveats, they all make sense. And I think they give a decent pushback to the overwhelming push by evangelicals. And I think there needs to be pushback. I think there has to be checks and balances. I'm a centrist. I like checks and balances. Okay, so he says, misunderstanding what atheism is. Well, wait a minute here. How can there be a misunderstanding of what atheism is if atheism is, what you wrote in here, descriptive? What do you mean by misunderstanding what atheism is by what usage? I mean, I understand what atheism is in the philosophical sense, in the academic sense. I understand what they mean by this. Do you? Are you misunderstanding what atheism is? What? In the academic sense? In the lay sense? In how you're using it? What misunderstanding what atheism is? What is atheism? Well, atheism in academia is the belief that God does not exist. How you're using it is your usage. But your usage is atypical. And you're allowed to do that, but it's not normative. It's not what you ought to use if you want to understand philosophy better. If you want to read a paper on atheism, your usage is not going to be in there. If it says Jane was agnostic, Bob was a theist, and Fred was an atheist, you're not going to know what those words mean because you're using a different understanding. Go read Dr. Burgess Jackson on his paper against flu, on a case against atheism, or against Flu's argument. He's very, very specific about atheism, theism, and agnosticism and how he uses those words in that paper. He tells you how he's using them. If you start using your usages, you're not going to make sense of his paper. Why? Because you're using a different usage that I've never seen any paper use other than a persuasion piece like Flu's. So what do you mean misunderstanding? Okay, so this doesn't apply to me because I understand atheism pretty well. Probably better than most, I would imagine, because that's what I've been talking about for years. I mean, does anybody think that I don't understand atheism? That would be weird. I mean, what do you want from me? I've read a lot of stuff on atheism. I don't know what else you think I have a misunderstanding of, because I understand it quite well. Believing that agnosticism is more intellectually honest. Well, to me, but that's just my personal thing. To somebody else, it may not be. Somebody might have reasons why to believe there's a God. They might have reasons to believe there's not a God. To me, my position for me is agnostic. Okay, but I'm not an agnostic evangelical. I'm not promoting agnosticism. I'm not going out telling everybody, hey, look, you should be agnostic because it's more intellectually honest. No, that Huxley would have promoted that. Yeah, that's his whole shtick. He was telling theists and atheists, you're not justified. But he was also basing that upon his understanding of epistemology from a scientific point of view. He only claimed that they weren't justified because of science. Which, by the way, the Satanic Temple would probably agree with Huxley on that. one of the tenets, there's 7 fundamental tenets of atheism. When it, of satanic, there's 7 fundamental tenets of satanic temple, and one of them is something along the lines of that beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. And so if beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world, then Huxley would agree with that, because you should base your beliefs upon scientific grounding. And I don't agree with that wholeheartedly, because there are beliefs that we have that are not based upon science from other forms of knowledge. But I agree that beliefs should be formed on that if you want to understand the scientific understanding of the universe. If you want to describe things scientifically, then yes, your scientific beliefs should conform to one's best scientific understanding of the world. But that's your scientific beliefs, not all your beliefs. So I mean, there's a little caveat there. But I think that Thomas Henry Huxley would absolutely agree with that beliefs should conform with the best scientific understanding. That's why he disagreed with both theist and atheist. And clearly he meant atheism as the belief that God does not exist. He wasn't disagreeing with atheism for withholding judgment. He wasn't saying atheists were unwarranted and unjustified for their position, meaning that they just lacked a belief. No. Atheism in his day was the belief that God does not exist, just like it is now. He was saying that both people, both groups, the theist and the atheist, neither of them were justified because neither of them had solid scientific justifications. Right? So, anybody says that, atheism has been a lack of belief, then explain to me why Huxley said theists and atheists are both wrong for having their positions, if your understanding of atheism is mere lack of belief. Because clearly that's not what he meant by it. Duh. Not wanting to associate with people who are perceived to be know-it-all firebrands, as with any group there are toxic members who hurt the brand, so to speak. That one he might actually have a point. I do know people that don't want to be considered atheists because they don't want to be associated with other atheists who are toxic people. I get that. I do understand that. But it is still their philosophical position if they believe there's no God. They can say, look, I believe there's no God, but I don't take the atheist label because I don't want to be associated with the other ones. I get that. It's a label. You don't have to adopt the label, right? That's a label is labeling somebody. You don't have to adopt that label. But your philosophical position is that you still believe there's no God, which in philosophy is called atheist. You don't have to adopt that label, though. So I kind of understand this one. It's not my position, but I'm fearing what other people might think. I couldn't care less. Again, I talk about Satanism a lot. Why would I care about the atheist label? Fearing the consequence of being an atheist, there are many places in the world where the admission of being an atheist will buy you abuse, cost you friends and family. People may even lose their freedom or their life. And that's true, too. Yeah, I agree. But on Twitter, that's usually not the case. Part 3, my specific position. I am an explicit, agnostic, positive atheist. What the hell does that even mean, dude? Seriously? Dude, come on. I am an explicit, agnostic, positive atheist. Nobody uses the terms like that because now you're just being absurd. Just call yourself an atheist. Now I know what his epistemic disposition is, right? He believes there's no God. Great. Just call yourself an atheist then. And get rid of this lack of theism nonsense. Because if you are a positive atheist, why not just use atheism like that? So you can just tell people, I'm an atheist. There's no God. Great. Why do you want to confuse people by this juxtapositioning of terms that are just incongruent with each other? Like if I said to you, I'm an explicit, agnostic, positive theist, you'd be like, what does that mean? Or I'm an explicit, agnostic, negative theist. What does that mean? Again, you can give your usage of these terms and give them some meaning connotatively to somebody, but it's a private language argument. I think it's Kawasa who's been making some great arguments about private language and Wittgenstein and how a beetle in a box type argument that if you are the only person who knows the language, is it really even a language at that point? You cannot communicate with somebody anything. A language to me seems to be something that has to convey to another person. A private language can be argued isn't a language. Because if you're the only one that knows it, then you cannot communicate with anybody. Right? I mean, to me, it makes sense to say a language has to convey some form of communication, something of information to somebody. That's what we mean by language. Private language, I mean, I think it could be argued as not a language. Again,
Argue it, don't argue it. I don't really care. Not a hill I want to die on. But to me, it just seems odd to have a language that doesn't communicate anything. I don't know that really qualifies as a language then. So then he says, minimum requirement. I lack the belief in the existence of God. I cannot truthfully affirm I believe God exists. Wait, what? Wait, what? He said, I'm an explicit, using his usages. He's explicit means he's aware of the proposition. Agnostic, he doesn't claim it as knowledge according to who uses this. Positive atheist, which goes back to here. A positive atheist. Wait, where was it? A belief that God does not exist. Okay. So, wait a minute here. He just says, I cannot truthfully affirm I believe God exists. But, oh, okay. I got it. Okay, I see what he's saying here. He's just saying that he lacks a belief. Okay, so, okay. I get what he's coming from. Okay, well, he meets the minimum requirement for, I don't know what, though. Explicit, I am familiar with the familiar idea of God. I've considered theistic beliefs, and I consciously do not believe it. Okay. But wouldn't explicit also mean I have considered theistic beliefs, and I do consciously do not believe it? So I consciously think they're false? I'm sorry. Couldn't explicit also include in a wood, on an Euler diagram, I am familiar with the idea of God, I've considered theistic beliefs, and I hold them as false. That still is explicit. Yeah. So explicit is also broken down further between somebody who is aware of the proposition and consciously does not believe it, and broken down to somebody who's aware of the proposition and consciously does believe it false. So now you have to break down explicit even further. In fact, that's what Wiki does if you go look at the Euler diagram. Positive, I believe God does not exist, with the caveat that God is defined as a divine entity that intervenes in the physical universe. I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that stipulative definition. When I talk about God, it is a divine being that intervenes, or at least can have the ability to prescribe changes in the universe. Simple. It's all I really want to know. I don't want to get into bogged down with the weeds of what somebody means by God. I'm asking you, do you think there's a being that has intentional states that can change the laws of the universe, or by which the universe would not exist if they didn't exist? A necessary being. A necessary being that must exist in all possible worlds. That's what I'm asking about. I don't care about anything else. So just upon that terminology of what God is, that's what I'm asking if you believe or not. I don't want to get into what you think is a God. I'm asking by my usages, what is your position? Agnostic. I do not claim to know that my belief is true. I am convinced but not certain. What does certainty have to do with anything? Certainly now there's another level of modifiers that knowledge doesn't even require. Knowledge doesn't require certainty. Not in the weak acceptance case. Indeed, if my reasons for believing are demonstrated to be unsound, my conviction will be falter and I will cease to believe, therefore becoming a negative atheist. But again, why do you want to even talk about your knowledge if you aren't talking about beliefs? You can only modify something if your belief first, because as he points out, knowledge is a subset of belief. So this is really confusing, what he means by explicit, agnostic, positive, atheist. You're not making anything simple. You're confusing people. You're complicating things. Based upon what he's told me here about his position, from a simple reading of this and from what I've gleaned from his position, if you were to say, hey, Steve, in philosophy, what is this guy? He's an atheist. Meaning he believes there's no God. I don't need any qualifiers. I don't need all this breaking down and subset of subset and these weird subsets like implicit and explicit and positive and negative. I don't need any of that. My schema, which is the philosophical schema, is so much simpler. You believe, you don't believe, you believe true, you believe false, you don't believe either way. Boom, done. That's it. So if I say to him, what's your position on the belief that God exists? He'll say, I believe false. There you go. That's your epistemic deposition. I believe false, which is disbelief P. There aren't other options. It's simple. What is your proposition? What is your belief on there is no God? I believe that's true. Okay, so belief's P. What's your position? There is a God. I disbelieve that or believe it's false. There you go. But if somebody says like Jane on the Gumballs, oh, I have no position either way. I don't believe even. I don't believe odd. I don't believe God exists. I believe God does not exist. Jane is agnostic. Please read my article, Gumballs and God, better explained in the video description when I put it there soon. Because I think my essay on it really explains it really well. It's been reviewed multiple times. Landon Kurt Knoll reviewed it. Dr. Joss Rasmussen reviewed it. A lot of people have read it and found it to be quite. Dr. Seigart, I believe it was him. But there's been a lot of people who read my paper, or some of my essays, not a paper, my essay, Gumballs and God, and said, this really explains your position so much better, Steve. And I'm like, cool, thank you. I go on to say, I'm not interested, or he goes on to say, I'm not interested to and never would try to convince anyone of my certain belief that God does not exist. Okay, but it doesn't have to do with certainty. It's just your belief. Certainty is irrelevant. For this reason, and also because there are no ideologies that depend on God not existing, naturalism, methodological naturalism depends on God not existing. If God exists, ontological or philosophical naturalism depends upon that. Depends on there being no supernatural beings. If God exists, naturalism, or at least ontological naturalism, is false. So it does depend on that. Now, it doesn't just only depend upon that, right? If ghosts exist, philosophical naturalism is wrong. So that is not necessarily true. For this reason, and also because there's no ideologies that depend on God not existing, the pragmatic difference between lacking belief in God's existence and believing that a God does not exist is negligible for me. I disagree. I think it's a massive difference. You know, if people believe there's no God, I think they're going to have things that are going to cohere more with their web of beliefs than merely if you just lack a belief. So I think there is a difference, right? If you lack a belief, you're not going to get into discussions with people why there is no God, for the most part, right? But if you're an atheist, you're more likely to go into these discussions to trying to change the mind of the theist to convince them that they're wrong. You know, an agnostic is not really trying to change the mind of a theist saying that they're wrong because they're not holding the position that they're wrong. But an atheist who believes there's no God, they are going to try to, if they go into discussion with a theist, probably on average want to change their position. Now, again, that doesn't necessarily always hold true, but these are just generalized statements. So I think there is a difference there. I do not think that my behavior as a positive atheist is different than I would be if I was a negative atheist. Really? So as a positive atheist, you never try to convince a theist that they're wrong? Maybe. I can't speak for him, but generally that's not the case. You know, I think that if you really sat down and asked him, okay, well, you're an atheist. You believe that there's no God. So therefore, parts of the Bible you have to think are false. Genesis is a myth to you or something. Or, you know, the earth, obviously young earth creation is false. We all know that. But I mean, him being an atheist, believing there's no God, is implying that young earth creation is wrong too. That's another belief that he had that entails that. Well, epistemically entails, or at least infers. Right? I mean, obviously people can be irrational of contradictions. But for the rational person, if you say there's no God, it epistemically commits you to creationism being false. It epistemically commits you that the Bible has false stories in it, or at least ones that are meant to be parables or myth, right? It's not just one belief. Beliefs, and I cannot say this enough, do not exist in a vacuum. Even though atheism is the belief that God does not exist, its position on the ontological status of God is one proposition. All beliefs seem to have some implication towards some other belief. They're all interrelated. I really don't know of a belief that stands on its own. It'd be hard-pressed for me to think to one. Could they exist? Maybe. But as of now, it really is very difficult for me to think of one. If you guys can think of a belief that stands on its own, great. But remember, every belief has a non-belief component. In my essay on definitions, I point that out. Every belief has a non-belief component. If you believe X, you don't believe not X. Right? All of them, all beliefs have some kind of a non-belief component to it. All right, let's finish this up. Going on the last part of it here. As such, I generally assume the minimum requirement position when speaking with other people. Why? If your belief is that there are no gods, why not take the stronger approach? Why water down your belief to saying, oh, you merely just lack a belief, especially when that's not your position, epistemologically speaking. You're not suspending judgment. You are making a judgment. You're making the judgment that the proposition of theism is false. You're affirming the proposition that God does not exist is true. You are not agnostic on P. So why water it down? Theistic belief is likely to be consequential, while atheist belief is not. Again, I disagree with that. If theism has to be consequential, I think that atheism, which is a negation of that, is consequential. I think atheists who want to make an impact to convince people that there are many forms of theism that are dangerous, it makes a difference. I mean, do you necessarily have to hold the position there's no God to realize some forms of theism are dangerous? No. But I sure think it gives you more motivation. I think it's easier to maybe convince people that their position may be wrong if you take a stronger approach. You know, if you don't take a strong approach in an argument, you're not going to really be convincing to them. So I do think you should take the strongest approach that you can reasonably articulate and argue for based upon your understanding of the topic to justify your position. And I'm not trying to say that as normative. I'm not trying to make that a principle. I don't know if there is such a principle. Maybe some philosopher watches this can tell me, is there a principle that you'd always take the strongest approach on something to argue? I don't know if there is or isn't. But I do think, generally speaking, certainly in debates, you need to take the strongest position you can against the strongest position that the opponent has. Steelman each other. So, all right, there's his references and notes. Stanford Encyclopedia, but the analysis of knowledge was correct. But by the way, he ignores the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on atheism, it seems, which shows that he's wrong about the general understanding, but whatever. Wikipedia, that's fine. Britannica, philosophical paper. Yeah. I mean, Oxford Dictionary, I don't really have an issue with any of these per se, Gumballs and God classification by Matt Dillahunty. Well, again, go read my Gumballs and God Better Explain article. It is in the video description now. Please read that. I implore everybody to read it. Please leave a comment in the video section what you think of it. Does it explain the Gumballs and God, and does not explain why this guy here is kind of all over the place, because he's using Gumballs and God's he's using Gumballs to relate to atheism, but not making the connection that it actually is showing why his understanding of atheism based upon his own personal usages should not be used in philosophy. It's confusing, and it just my only question is why? Why would you want to do this, man? Go read the actual philosophical papers, and it's so much easier. You don't need all this nonsense. You just don't. All right, I'm going to wrap it up, guys. Thanks for watching Caffeine Corner today. I know it's a Sunday. I usually do them on Mondays, but I got to work tomorrow, so I was off today. But I do want to thank my mods, April and Chemo, for popping by. Autistic Shill, hello. And everybody else who couldn't make it, who watches in the Rewind crew. Please, like I said, leave a comment. I do read them, and I appreciate it. That's it. I'm going to go outside now and get some sun. It is hot outside, and I want to get a little bit of tan. So I'm going to enjoy the rest of my Sunday. I wish everybody else the best, and look forward to reading your comments. And if I made at least a decent argument against this guy Jaco, Jaco. Hopefully he'll correct me in how to pronounce it. And I did tag him, so hopefully he'll watch it. Maybe he'll learn something. If you want to write a response to do a video, I'm happy to reply to that, and even have him on if he's interested. But I really do think that I pointed out the extreme problems with his blog here, and why his personal usages should be not used and should be eschewed. For the very reason it's just very confusing. But all right, good night, Autistic Shill. Thank you. We'll see you later.